So, you guys remember back when I used to do, before what I watched was a thing, and I was way more consistent with like movie reviews, with like reviewing things individually. I used to do catcher reviews, and it's been a minute since I've done one. And reflecting upon the year and things like that, I came to the realization that there's a bunch of movies that I still have not reviewed. And so, obviously, I do need to do a catch-up review. Don't expect this to be normal, because, these are usually a little bit more frequent, now that what I watched is a thing that's kind of in place of the catch-up reviews, as you guys know. But I just figured, before I do my best list and things like that, it probably just makes the most sense to do a catch-up review, talk about the few movies that I have left over, and I'm going to try to get through it as quickly as possible because there are quite a few movies to talk about here. One of the reasons being is that the catch-up review that I did back in, May, if you guys remember, somehow got cut off at the end. I don't know what ended up happening, but I recently found out that video did not upload in its entirety. So the last 5 films that I talked about, it got cut out, and I don't know what happened. So I'm going to start off talking about those. I'm going to try to cycle through them as quickly as I can. I assume I'll cycle through them pretty quickly because, to be honest with you, I've kind of forgotten about some of these movies. But I'm going to try to remember to the best of my recollection what I said. So we're going to try to fly through these as quickly as possible. Only disclaimer right off the bat is the only films that will not be discussed in this video are movies that I have talked about in my worst list because you guys already know how I feel about them. It doesn't really make sense for me to go on a whole other rant about how, Meet the Blacks 2 sucks and, talk about how much I hated Cosmic Sin or things like that. If you guys really want to hear my thoughts on those movies, just watch my worst list video. I go pretty in depth in that, so I don't really think there's a reason to delve into that any further than I really did. So we're just gonna go ahead and without further ado, just get into the first movie. So like I said, the video did get cut off at the end, so we're going to start off with the movies that I talked about in the last catch review. First off being Every Breath You Take, which was a film that I was not very excited for, mainly because of the fact that the director of Terminal was behind it, and, when you watch a film from a director like, Von Stein, there are certain expectations that I had going into it, and the only real expectation I had is that however this movie ended, it was going to be something really fucking off the rails. And to be honest with you, the reason this movie is bad is not because of how off the rails it gets and how many plot directions come out of nowhere and things like that. This movie actually has the opposite problem in that it's a little too simplistic with what it decides to do, because I actually do think there are some interesting things about this movie. I think the premise is sort of interesting with this psychiatrist and him kind of reflecting on his patient that took her own life, and her brother kind of comes into the mix and things kind of get complicated. I think that's an interesting premise, but there just isn't really a lot they end up doing with it. And Casey Affleck is pretty good here. I think he does give a pretty solid performance. I think Michelle Monaghan probably gives the best performance within the entire movie. I really liked what she ended up doing here, especially. Sam Claflin, though, unfortunately, is just very miscast here. You don't really buy him in this role at all. He's supposed to be someone that is, charming enough to where people are going to be deceived by what he's doing, and it just doesn't really work. He just feels super obvious the entire movie because this is not Sam Claflin in his usual element, and I just don't think he did a very good job here very much at all. And Sam Claflin can play a really damn good villain. You guys remember how good he was in The Nightingale, so, I just think that he was badly directed here. I don't really blame his performance necessarily. Again, I don't really have much else to say besides that. The girl that ends up taking her life, we don't really focus on that much. She kind of does feel like a plot device, which is kind of gross, but the majority of this movie, it's just very cheesy. It honestly at points does kind of feel like a Lifetime movie, but not even an interesting one that's really over the top, that's really over the top and has all this crazy, moments going on. It's not even like that. It's much more something that is a lot more dull in that way. And I'd say that's the biggest issue with this movie, is that throughout the entire film, it just feels very dull and stale. And once we get to the twist, which again, I was expecting to be something really just insane, I just found myself extremely underwhelmed by what they decided to do. It was probably the most obvious twist that they could have come up with, and I just don't think they did a very good job with that. So honestly, I kind of wish this movie took more risks. I kind of wish this movie went in a crazier direction, because at least I would say at least they took a chance. This movie didn't take a chance and just made me upset. So Von Stein seems to have issues with both. He has issues with making a movie that is really ridiculous and goes in some really absurd directions that feel completely unearned, and he has issues with more simplistic movies that take, obvious directions and, again, just feel underwhelming. So I just don't think Von Stein's a very good director at the end of the day. I think that's the conclusion we've come to. D+ for this one, not really much else to say. Let's just move on to the next movie. Concrete Cowboy, I don't remember. I will be straight up with you guys. I don't remember this movie very much at all, so I really do not have very much to say. I remember that Idris Elba was good for what he had. I remember that he gave a pretty solid performance, but I wanted a lot more from him in this movie. I think they could have delved deeper into his character. Caleb McLaughlin, I think, is honestly a really good lead performance here. He really does show that he can carry a movie very well, and I think they do a good job with that. And I think the best part of the movie is the relation between him and Idris Elba. I think that they work very well together. Only real issues with the movie is, one, I just was never super into what was going on. The plot just wasn't one that was all that interesting to me, and so I just found it to be very just kind of all right. It wasn't boring or anything like that, but it just never really sucked me in the way I wanted to. And there is a big plot turn that happens like towards the third act of this movie, and it just did not really work. I get what they were going for, but it just, nothing really felt set up. It didn't really feel like we were really hinting at this happening. It just felt very unearned, and I think they could have done a much better job with that. But again, I like films like this that focus on, a different way of life and things like that, and I think this movie does cover that pretty well. I just, at the end of the day, really want a little bit more from it, so C+ for Concrete Cowboy. Definitely has its moments, but other than that, not really much else to say. I probably went more into depth in the original video, but that got cut off, so next movie. In the Earth is extremely frustrating to me, because there's a lot to really like about this movie. I think the performances right off the bat are really good here. Everyone does do a really good job, I think, especially when it comes to especially when it comes to Reece Shearsmith as Zach. He is so good in this movie. This is a character that you are incredibly dubious of the entire time. You never know if he actually is as good-natured as he seems, or if he has something more sinister behind, but you can understand, he does a great job presenting both sides, where it's like you can see this guy as just very, just very kind, and someone that is really just trying to help them out, and he's like, doing all these good deeds, or you could see him as someone that is a lot more demented in that way, and I think that he gives a really strong performance here. I think the style of this film is also really good. I really like what they tried to do in terms of that. I thought it worked quite well. The issue with this movie is that I unfortunately do think it's a bit style over substance. I just think that the story here is a little bit lacking. It's very simple, where we're focusing on this virus that's not COVID, but clearly supposed to be like COVID, and it's taken over the world, and these like scientists have to go on this mission to try to retrieve this other scientist to try to figure out, what's really going on. Is there a path forward and things like that? But it just doesn't really go anywhere until the third act. And once it finally does go somewhere, it just feels a little too brief. I really did want more when it came to this premise. I think there was a lot more they could do when it came to these characters. The characters we're following are not interesting here at all, aside from Zach. I just wasn't really super into what was going on. And again, it really just takes forever for anything to happen. The first two acts especially are really boring, and they just didn't really do a lot to really hook me in. And once we got to that third act, it started to get a bit more interesting, but it was to a point where I just didn't really care that much. I had already checked out. I just didn't really have much of a reason to stick around. So I think there are things to like about this movie. I think Ben Wheatley's directing is pretty good here. It's very unsettling in that way, but I think as a film, it just doesn't really go much of anywhere, and I really just wanted a lot more from it at the end of the day. I think atmospherically, like, there's a lot to like about this, but it's very clear this is another film that, like, if the pandemic hadn't existed, this probably would have had a lot more time spent on it to, like, really make an impact, and it just felt kind of rushed at the end of the day. So overall, like, I think that there really wasn't much to this film. It really just kind of feels like something that Wheatley wrote to kind of, like, ease the boredom, get those creative juices flowing during some really dark days. But overall, you know, there's some cool ideas, there's some good body horror, but it just didn't really work much for me. And after a while, like, the flashing lights and things like that really just felt like it was overcompensation for what is a really flat story. So C for In the Earth has some good ideas, but as a whole, didn't do much for me. We Broke Up, I honestly found to be very disappointing. The thing I will say right off the bat is I do think both Aya Cash and William Jackson Harper work well together in this movie. I think that they do have pretty solid chemistry here, and you are rooting for this couple. You want things to go right for them. You want them to be able to rekindle their relationship, and I think that overall they do a good job with that. The movie also does have some pretty funny moments. There were moments here where I was laughing. I do think there are some pretty good gags here, but I have two really big issues that do unfortunately bring this movie down. One is that I think it just gets way too repetitive after a while. There's only so much you can do with this premise of these two pretending to get back together, and constantly having to, like, skirt their ways around it, of the fact that they're broken up. I think that at first there were some really fun moments there, but after a while, it just really felt tiresome, and I felt like they needed to do more with it, and they just never really did. But honestly, the biggest issue that I think brings this down is the reasoning why these two did break up. We don't find out. Obviously, in the beginning of the movie, yes, they've broken up. But we don't find out any sort of insight into their relationship of what really happened until literally the last, like, 15 to 20 minutes of this movie, and it just wasn't a very interesting reason. Like, I just found it to be honestly quite kind of just mundane, and it was like, you broke up over that? Like, I just felt there was a lot more they needed to do here to get me into this relationship, because again, I think the two of them have good chemistry, but as a whole, by the end of the film, I just didn't really care if these two got back together or split apart, because it just wasn't an interesting enough study, I think, on these kind of, like, you know, failing relationships. I think there was a lot more this film could have said. I think that Jeff Rosenberg as the director is a little too inconsistent when it comes to the comedy at points. So, I mean, there's definitely some charming moments. I think there's some things that do overall work here, but as a whole, I just was not very impressed by this one. It honestly did feel quite underwhelming by the time it ended. It's nothing I would absolutely hate. I think it does pass the time pretty well, but it's incredibly forgettable by the time it ends, and I really don't have much else to say beyond that. So C+ for We Broke Up. Really kind of want a lot more from this one. Things Heard and Seen, I think, is very overlooked. This is a movie that I think has a very interesting sort of atmosphere behind it. I think a lot of people are going to go into this movie and they're going to expect some kind of, like, you know, typical paranormal thriller. And I'll say right now, that is not what this movie is. This is way more in the vein of, like, an A24 type horror movie. And honestly, I think it's much better because of that. I really like a lot of what this film is going for in terms of how we're focusing more on this relationship of sorts and sort of the toxicity of it, especially when it comes to the character of George. Very fascinating character when it comes to what's going on with them, because it seems like these two kind of have it all, but there's a lot that George is hiding from her. There's a lot that's going on behind the curtain, and I do think this movie does play into that very well. And James Norton is so good in this movie. I thought that he gave a really strong performance. He honestly was the big standout for me here. And Amanda Seyfried's good too. Like, she definitely does give a strong performance, but it was really James Norton's character that really did end up kind of blowing me away here. There's a lot more they do with this character than I really did expect. He's not just like the, you know, seemingly perfect, like, husband that is, like, a lot more toxic. No, there's a lot more going on with him besides that, and I think that's something that this movie does do a pretty good job with. Some of the, you know, some of the directions it went in, honestly, very much did surprise me, especially the third act is kind of perfect. I was honestly really riveted by the directions they end up going. I like the message that this movie is really going for. I thought all of that was very interesting overall. I think think really my biggest issue with this movie is that there are just a few characters here that just don't really serve that much of a purpose at the end of the day. Specifically, Natalia Dyer's character, there is some stuff with her that we do get that I think is kind of interesting, but by the end of it, I just found her character to be a little bit underwhelming. Rhea Seehorn as well, I just didn't feel satisfied with the directions her character ended up going. I think they needed to do just a little bit more with her, but by the way this wrapped up, and especially the cinematography, really well done. I really like the visual style of this movie. It's like it's a very specific and very like eerie one in that way, but it feels kind of like artsier than you'd expect. I really do like the chances that this movie does take. I think the fact that it is at 2 hours, they're able to really flesh out the story to its potential. So overall, I like this a lot more than I expected to. I was kind of expecting this to be kind of just like a throwaway horror film, but it did a little bit more than I was expecting, and that's something that I really do enjoy about this film. I will also say, as good as Amanda Seyfried is, there really isn't a lot to Catherine's character. She's kind of just like the housewife of sorts that is trying to be the best possible wife that she can be, and there just isn't really all that much to her. But overall, like I said, I think this is a much better movie than people did give it credit for. So B- for Things Heard and Seen. I think it's not going to be a film for everyone, but I think if you're into more like slow moving type horror films that really aren't filled with like a ton of jump scares, I think this one is maybe going to win you over. I was honestly surprised by this one quite a bit. The Outside Story really let me down, I think. This is a premise that I do think can work quite well. I like the idea of this guy kind of getting locked out of his apartment and things like that. I think that sounds like a really interesting premise, and him having to actually like venture outside and experience the world when he's usually like very reclusive in that way. I think there are some interesting things they do with that. And Brian Tyree Henry is very good in this movie. He very much shows he can carry a movie very well. I'm glad that he is starring in a film. I just wish the film he was in was a lot better than this one, because ultimately, my biggest issue with this movie is that it just, at the end of the day, does not really amount to all that much. This is a film that is really trying to do a lot, and sometimes there are moments where it does work quite well. There's a moment where he runs into this little girl who plays the piano, and she's not really pursuing it all that much, and he kind of gets her to, you know, put more effort into it, and I thought that relationship was very sweet. I really liked that particular story and where they end up going with it. But when you have that, you also have Nina Mani as a cop, and it just doesn't quite work with what they're trying to do with her, and I don't think her character really fit into this movie at all. There's a lot of things with her especially that I found kind of problematic with the directions they ended up going with her. There's also just a lot of pointless things that happen in this movie, a lot of characters we kind of stumble across, and I'm like, what was really the point of this? What were we really trying to get at here? I don't think they did a great job with that, and unfortunately, the relationship when it comes to him and Sonequa Martin Green, when we start to dive deeper into it, I just felt a little too brief for my liking. I needed a little bit more insight into what exactly went wrong between these two to get them to this point, and I just don't think the movie did a great job with that. So don't get me wrong, there are some fun moments here, there are things to like about this movie, but at the end of the day, I just really felt this was very throwaway and didn't really do much for me. So yeah, C for The Outside Story. Certainly has its moments, but didn't really make the impact that I think it really needed to. Oh my god, 4 Good Days. I have actually quite a bit to say about this one. I said quite a bit, I remember originally. I mean, this is really one of those movies where if you're talking about a movie that comes out in like the midpoint of the year but is like begging to get like Oscars and things like that, but there's like no way in hell it's going to, that's 4 Good Days. This is really a movie that is out so it can get Glenn Close or Mila Kunis some kind of Oscar nomination. And I will say, Mila Kunis is very good in this movie. This film really does showcase her true talents very well, and I do think she does a really good job here playing this character of Molly, someone that you can tell is really doing what she can to try to go through, you know, substance abuse, but she's constantly pulled back into the drugs. She's trying to recover as much as she can, but she does a pretty good job of of showing the desperation this character is going through and, you know, why she might have gotten to that point. I think she does do a really good job. The problem is, I can't say the same for Glenn Close, who is just really hamming it up throughout this entire movie, and not like how, say, she does for, like, Cruella de Vil, where it's, like, intentional. No, here, she's giving a really just laughable performance. There's one scene especially involving a hospital, and just the dialogue she ended up saying, I couldn't help but laugh. I audibly laughed in the theater, and maybe people looked at me and thought I was crazy for laughing, but god damn it, I did, because I just thought it was so ridiculous, the directions they ended up going when it came to this film. It also doesn't help that the movie as a whole is just really predictable with where it ends up going. Practically every single place this movie goes, you can probably hint at early on. It's very easy to tell what they're trying to get at when it comes to this movie. And because that the movie just feels very dull after a while. The movie is almost 2 hours long, and there really is no reason for it to be. Just because, again, this is a very simple premise with this girl trying to recover, you know, from addiction and things like that, and kind of like showing the critical stages. I think they could have done a much better job with that. And I also found the story between mother and daughter very underwritten as a whole. There's a good scene with Glenn Close and her talking to, like, her husband about, you know, where they went wrong with Mila Kunis as a whole, but I just don't think it really went to the places that it needed to. It was like, this is a really good scene, but it also just kind of feels like exposition that I would have much rather seen play out throughout the movie. So again, there's just a lot of things that really frustrate me about this film. The cinematography also is just not very good here. It's very ugly to look at, and it just looks very, like, cheaply made in that way. Overall, this is just a very generic sort of like addiction recovery drama that I think you've seen a bunch of times before. The ending as well really pissed me off with where it ended up going. I thought that it was just way too hackneyed and just didn't feel realistic at all to what was going on, especially with the way the direction the movie was going. Really just came out of left field. I don't think they did a very good job with that. Again, Mila Kunis, really good in this movie. I'm glad there's a film that showcases, like, her dramatic, you know, her dramatic chops as an actress, but overall, this just really did not do it for me. I really just found myself kind of groaning throughout this entire film. C for Good Days. It's a movie you probably didn't see, and for good reason, because it really isn't anything that great. Okay, so we've made it through all the ones that I was originally supposed to discuss in the previous Catcher review. Let's get into the ones that I already had planned to talk about in this one. Starting off with French Exit, a movie I was honestly very much looking forward to. I thought it had a really interesting premise behind it, where you have this mother and son who are just filthy rich and, you know, basically have the world at the palm of their hands, and then it all gets, you know, zapped away in a second once the patriarch of their family ends up dying, and basically, you know, they lose they lose the will and things like that, and basically, you know, all of their, like, the bank takes their, you know, money away and things like that. Like, what are they really gonna do? The problem is not much, because this film is honestly pretty dull, and there were some things that I think do work here. Right off the bat, I will say easily the best part of this movie is Michelle Pfeiffer. I think that she is fantastic in this film. This is easily one of her best performances to date. You can tell that there's a lot of sort of unresolved feelings she has towards her son, towards her marriage, and really just slowly lets it all out, and I thought that she did a really good job with this role overall. There was a lot of, like, juicy monologues that she really does kill here, and I think she gets into the character of Frances Price pretty well. Lucas Hedges is good, but he honestly doesn't have much to do here. He's mostly relegated to just this, like, romantic subplot with Imogen Poots' character, and they don't really do a ton with him beyond that, and I wish we could have seen more with him, and especially when it comes to the interactions between these two, there's not a lot. There's a lot of scenes where he's off doing his own thing and she's talking to someone else, and there isn't a ton of interaction between them, and I think that's where this movie does succeed the most, is the interaction between these two, because they definitely do have that chemistry, but the movie just never really plays into it all that much, and that was definitely, like, disappointing to me, so I really did want a lot more from that, and I also just found the plot here to just not be very exciting. They don't really do much with it. This really does kind of feel like a film that just doesn't really go much of anywhere, and for a movie that's like almost 2 hours long, I just needed this to be I just needed this to do a lot more. The comedy also really did fall flat for me, and these weren't really characters I really enjoyed following. I just found them to be very like spoiled, very selfish people, and they just didn't really intrigue me all that much. So at the end of the day, I just wasn't really that into this. It's not terrible or anything, but it's a film that I definitely think could have done a lot more than it ultimately did. So C for French Exit. I wouldn't say it's like completely unwatchable, but it really is nothing that special. The Vigil is a much different movie than I really did expect, and I mean that in the best way possible. This is a film that I think is a really interesting sort of premise behind it. I like the idea that we're following this guy who he has to look after this deceased member of his like Jewish community. He's very entrenched in this community. It means a lot to him, but he also is struggling to deal with something that went down in his youth. And throughout the movie, we don't really know what's going on, and eventually we get more of a sense of his personal trauma, and that's what really did connect me to this film. When we start to dive deeper into what Yaakov has gone through, I think the movie really does succeed. And while I do think that the buildup is a little slow, I always found myself intrigued by what was going on, mainly because we do have a really threatening spirit here in the form of a Masik, which the literal definition of that in Jewish mythology is basically a demon that latches onto anyone that like has some kind of harm or some kind of damage like in their lives. It kind of like latches onto them, and I thought that was a really interesting idea, and this movie really does do a lot with that. The way this film does dive into the trauma that this character has gone through in a very personal way, I thought they did a really excellent job with here. And Dave Davis is fantastic in this role. He really does a great job of showing how much he is like internalized this, and how he really does kind of have to come to terms with what happened. He's been keeping it locked away for a long time, and he finally does, and when he does, it just feels so rewarding. Like I said, the movie does have a very like creepy atmosphere to it, and that's something I think it does a good job with. And the sense of community in this film as well, when it comes to certain rules that this community has to follow and things like that, you can see that he is very much questioning. I really liked where his character ended up going throughout the end of this. I do think the movie is a little too short. I think there were some things that we could have maybe spent a bit more time on. Yaakov has this relationship in the movie that we just don't really focus that much on. He talks to this girl, Sarah, through Skype a lot, and I don't know if that's a COVID thing, because they filmed this movie before COVID happened, so I don't think that's something that we can blame, but it just felt like they could have done a little bit more with that. But overall, I really don't have too many complaints with this at all. I think the directing here by Keith Thomas is very well done. He's actually going to be directing the Firestarter remake later this year, which I'll be honest, I'm not like anticipating all that much, but the one hope I do have for it is now him being behind it, and if it's anywhere near as unsettling as this film was, I think we are in pretty good shape when it comes to that film. So overall, yeah, I think I can say I was a pretty big fan of this one. B+ for The Vigil. Not many people watch this movie, and it's a shame, because I really do think it is something special, and I very much do recommend it. Together is great. This is a film that I really wanted to catch at Sundance last year, and I just didn't really get a chance to, but thankfully I was like finally able to watch it like earlier this month, and my god, this film very much lived up to the hype for me. Right off the bat, the chemistry between Ed Helms and Patty Harrison is so rock solid here. These two work so well together. Ed Helms, more like very calming demeanor mixed with Patty Harrison's, I'd say, much more louder personality, I think mesh very well here. I like the way these two balance each other out. I thought they did a pretty good job with that. Patty Harrison, I would probably say, is the standout of this movie. I've never really seen her before, but after this film, I'm a big fan, and anything she does, like, post this film, I will get excited for. I think she just did such a incredible job here. And when it comes to Anna as a character, this is someone you really do latch onto. This is just some 20-something that like works at this coffee shop and randomly becomes a surrogate. And you can see that she has her own sort of hopes and dreams, wanting to get into college and all this stuff. And, you're wondering why she has any interest in really following, in becoming becoming this surrogate for Ed Helms, and we eventually do get at it, and it just added this other layer to her character that I really did love quite a bit. I like the way that she looks at life, and then Nat as a character, you know, what he really is going through, I also found to be quite interesting, and so I found both characters very interesting here, and the way they handle their relationship I thought was honestly very tasteful. The movie never really gets into like uncomfortable territory when it comes to it. Obviously, you know, there are points where they joke at it. You know, Anna has this friend that will jokingly say that, like, the two of them have, like, romantic chemistry, but the movie doesn't really go there all that much. It's much more of, like, a friendship and this sort of, like, this sort of, like, companionship that they have, and I thought it worked really well. Like, you really do find yourself just falling in love with their overall bond in this movie, and I thought they worked really well together. The way the movie ended, I will say, was a little abrupt, but I think it was pretty fitting with the way that it did end up turning out. There are some really funny moments here that definitely did have me laughing pretty hard, but there are also some really tender moments, and so I think overall it's just a movie that is really going to kind of sneak up on you and that a lot of people aren't going to expect. It's cool to see Ed Helms in a more dramatic light, and he does a really good job when it comes to this movie. Nicole Beckwith, I think, did a really good job at directing this film, balancing like the comedy and the more sort of like dramatic moments. I thought worked really well here. So overall, yeah, I like this one quite a bit. I think that it's another one that just has not gotten enough attention, and I wish more people were talking about it. So definitely an A- for Together Together. Out of the movies I'm talking about here, it's definitely one of the ones I think I'm the biggest fan of. So, in recording this video, I realized that there are two films that I did forget to talk about, so we're gonna go ahead. I know that this is going to be very awkward in terms of editing because, you know, you can tell that it's a different day, but whatever. I'm gonna go ahead and talk about this first one. Bad Trip. This film, I watched all the way back in 2020 when it was originally supposed to come out. It never came out last year, and I still forgot to talk about it. And so at the risk of me forgetting it again, I'm going to talk about it here. I actually like this one quite a bit. I was kind of dreading it going into it, to be honest with you. It looked like a very like obnoxious and ridiculous movie, but this actually is a lot of fun. I think what works really well about this film is just the commitment that all three of these actors really do have. Eric Andre and Tiffany Haddish especially are so good here. There's so many things that they're required to do, and you would expect them to be like, no, this is too ridiculous. Why would we ever do something like that? And they never really get to that length. They always just kind of go for it, and I really do respect that out of them as actors. Like, I already respected them, but this movie made me respect them even more so, and I think that works really well. And the comedy is just so good here. There's so many moments that have me laughing hysterically. There's a scene especially involving a zoo. That's all I'm going to say. It's easily the funniest scene in the entire movie. And also just, again, the novelty of doing all of this in public and not telling other people that they're filming a movie. You know, seeing these real reactions to things, it just makes it that much funnier, and I think it works really well. I'm not always a fan of movies like this, but I think it really kind of like enhances the experience for this one. It also helps that aside from, this movie isn't just like a bunch of gags. It actually does have a pretty good story behind it that I actually did like quite a bit. There's a nice little love story that's in there that I think works pretty well. So overall, yeah, I was a fan of this one. It's nothing amazing, but I think for what it is, it really does get the job done nicely, and I think it's one of the better of these sort of like hidden camera like comedy films. B- for this one for sure. Here today, I have not heard many people talk about, and it's understandable why, because this movie is not the kind of movie that we really do see much at all. Sort of like buddy comedy, but one that is very dry in that way, and I think that's something that a lot of people aren't going to like all that much. But I will say, I don't think this is like a terrible movie or anything. I heard a lot of people say this was like an absolute train wreck, and it ruined Billy Crystal's career forever, and he's never gonna come back, and I just don't really see that. I actually think Billy Crystal is easily the best part of this entire movie because he really hasn't lost that like comedic edge and wit to him. Actually, like last month, I for the first time watched When Harry Met Sally, and if you watch him there and you watch him in this, he really hasn't lost his touch at all. He still just does such a great job with that. You really just latch onto that sort of, you know, again, that edge that he always does have to him, the things that he says in this movie, he just does such a great job with, and I think that he was just really strong in this film. And I like what this film does have to say about dementia. There's a really good moment, especially where you can see throughout this film, this character, he has a very specific routine and he slowly starts to forget about it. And for me, that was probably the most hard-hitting moment of the entire movie. I really liked what they decided to do with that, and I think that angle works really well here. Also, when it gets into him aging and things like that, actually ends up being one of the stronger elements, because this is a character that he has had his own brand of comedy for a while, and he slowly is starting to feel a bit detached, just feel like he doesn't really fit into, modern standards anymore. And there's a really great scene where he starts, ranting about comedy and how people just don't really want to laugh anymore and things like that. And what could have come across, I think, is like very pretentious and very much like a boomer type rant, actually end up having a little bit more substance to it. And it felt like there was a personal touch to Billy Crystal. Like, this was kind of him annoyed at the way certain things have become, and I thought he did do a pretty good job with that. So I thought that part of the movie was honestly very strong. I like when we get into this sort of movie that he is putting together. I think all of that is really interesting overall. And Tiffany Haddish is also very good here. She proves that she can dive into dramatic work quite well. I think the bond that these two have is one that you are going to find yourself latching onto. It's very sweet, and it's something that I think a lot of people are going to find themselves enjoying. The problem is, the movie as a whole, the further you get into it, you really start to realize that there's a lot of elements here that are just very underwritten, particularly when it comes to his children in this movie. I get the fact that his character is someone that has made a lot of decisions in his life that are really hurting his kids. This is someone that will constantly flash back to, like, his wife and things like that. And those are also some of the best moments of the movie, when he is reflecting upon the life that him and his wife used to have together, and how much better things were then, and how he's become a bit more aloof since then. But my God, the way the kids treat their dad in this movie is just unbearable. And look, I'm a fan of both Penn Badgley and Laura Benatti. I think they're both really good actors. Penn Badgley especially is phenomenal. I've seen a little bit of You, and he is so good in that. But I could not stand either of their characters in this movie because of just how resentful they are towards their father. All he wants to do is, like, get to know his daughter's his daughter's child. That's all he really does want to do, and they want to keep her out of it and anything that he has going on. They want to stay as far away from it as possible. They want nothing to do with Tiffany Haddish. I just couldn't stand them in this movie. It's so mean-spirited in that way, and when they eventually do come around, it's good, but it's like, this is what took you to come around? Like, it just really did not work for me at all, and I just did not like anything going on in terms of his children here. The movie also just gets very schmaltzy at points. Like, there are a lot of moments where Billy Crystal's character is really laying it on thick about the way he's treated his children, and it just did not really work for me, especially in the third act. I think it just gets way too melodramatic. There's a certain direction that it takes, and it really just felt like, we need this emotional punch. We really need to sell how powerful this movie can be, and it just didn't really work very much at all. I think there are some moments here that are very enjoyable. Like I said, Billy Crystal and Tiffany Haddish do work well together. I like the impact that they have on each other's life. I like what this movie has to say about dementia and grieving and grieving and aging and things like that. But as a whole, it's a movie that I think could have been a lot better in many aspects. I think it needed a lot of rewrites, and I think that's what does ultimately bring this down. So C+ for here today. It's definitely enjoyable in a lot of aspects, but as a whole, it's a movie that I want a lot more from. Oh my God, mainstream. I mean, talk about a movie that is so desperate to talk about, like, technology and the internet age, but really has like nothing interesting to say about it whatsoever. This really does kind of feel like a movie that was thrown together because someone wanted to make a dissertation about how much, the internet age just sucks and all of the negatives, and not really focus on the positives here at all. This is one of those movies where they really try to dive deep into like the darker aspects of it, but the problem is it does it in such a surface level manner. It really doesn't have much to say here at all, other than, yeah, there's bad people in the internet, and if you try to repeat the same things that other people are doing, you're gonna get yourself seriously hurt. Like, we know this. Like, there's nothing really this movie is trying to say, and I don't think they did a very good job with that. It also doesn't help that our main character is honestly very one note, and I like Maya Hawke a lot. I think she honestly is a phenomenal actress. Everything she's been in, I've been a big fan of, but her character is not compelling here at all. She's just someone who wants to become like an influencer, and she starts to gravitate towards Andrew Garfield's character, and there just isn't really much to her in this movie at all. I didn't find her character particularly interesting, and I don't think that she really worked in this movie. The one thing that really does save this movie, though, from being utterly unwatchable is Andrew Garfield. He is phenomenal in this movie. If it wasn't for Tick, Tick, Boom, this could be a contender for one of his best performances, because he really does just go all out here to be as outrageous as he really can, and really just commands the entire movie, I think. I mean, his character, yeah, you look at him and he kind of is like a Jake Paul of sorts, but he really does commit to Link as a character, showing how this is someone, how he latches on to people, how he tries to, preach about, the good things that he's doing, but also is doing a lot of like, sketchy shit and things like that, and also the crazy videos he's putting out. All of it, he just relishes in. He single-handedly is the best thing about this entire movie, and whenever he's not on screen, this film is just absolutely unwatchable. There's a love triangle with Nat Wolff especially that was honestly infuriating to watch, because it really just felt like it's here, so there's some sort of conflict in the movie, and I didn't really feel like it needed to be here whatsoever. I think you honestly could have cut it out of the movie, and I don't think they did a very good job with that. Again, there are some things this movie tries to say about technology that I think is a little interesting, but it just feels a bit half-assed at the end of the day. The ending itself is effective. Like, the way the movie wraps up, I do think ends on a pretty good note, but it doesn't feel complete. It feels like the movie needed another like 20 to 30 minutes to really get its point across, because it feels like right at the end, this is when the movie really does start to like find its footing in a way, and could have had a really solid third act, but then it just kind of ends, and I needed a lot more from the movie to really make that impact, really show me what is this movie trying to say about technology that hasn't been said before, and they never really get to that point. So as a whole, this film just really didn't make any impact on me whatsoever, other than a honestly masterful performance from Andrew Garfield. There really isn't much to say about this one. The style here is honestly very annoying. I found this movie very tiresome. The characters themselves are absolutely insufferable in this film, and just in general, I just found this film really on the nose and just not a very fun experience. So yeah, C- unfortunately for mainstream. Again, there's like one element that really does hold the movie together, but virtually everything else really does fall apart, and I just don't think this is really worth watching at all, other than that one performance I mentioned. Oxygen's another one I've heard almost no one talk about, and it's a little unfortunate, because I actually do think this is a pretty solid thriller. Sure, at the beginning it seems like something you have seen before, where it's like this woman is in this cryogenic chamber, has no recollection of how, she really gets there, and she has to, try to piece together what's going on. We've seen that premise done before, but this movie does do enough that is fresh to make it work. It also helps that the movie is very chilling throughout. I mean, there were so many moments here that really did have me on the edge of my seat. It has this very like unsettling atmosphere, and I think they do a really good job with that. Mylène Laurent is also phenomenal in this movie. She gives such a good performance here, really just latching onto this character, how confused she is, how petrified she is to be in the situation, and I think overall does do a really good job. And the mystery itself I found to be very compelling. You are just as desperate as her to get to the bottom of things. You want to know what's going on. As the film goes on, it starts to become more and more you know, utterly terrifying with what's going on with her, and I think they did a really good job with that. My only real issue with this movie is honestly a pretty big one. Once the reveal actually happens, I just felt it was a little bit clunky, and I just don't think that the actual reveal was all that satisfying, because they really just kind of rushed through it as quickly as possible, and I felt like the movie needed at least like 20 more minutes to really just give us a second to unpack everything, because the movie doesn't really give us a second to breathe. And I understand for the first 2 acts, like, that makes sense, because it's like, you know, we're going through this experience with her, but when she starts to realize what's going on, it just kind of moves on to the next thing. We barely have any time to process any of the information that we're receiving, and I just don't think they did a really great job with that. Still, though, this is a really effective thriller, and I do think it gets the job done pretty well, and there's a lot of things that I really do recommend about this one. So overall, B- for Oxygen. Could have been better when it comes to the actual reveal, but the movie is so filled with tension throughout that I just can't help but recommend this one. I don't think this is a movie a lot of people saw, but I do think this one is overall worth giving a watch. Another movie I don't think a lot of people have heard much about, Profile. This was a major release in, like, the summer. I remember I saw this. I was, like, one of the only people in the theater. It's actually really good, though, I have to say. I can understand why, watching the trailer, people can be kind of turned off, because it's another one of those, like, you know, not Unfriended, because this is not a horror movie, but kind of like Unfriended, where it's like a movie that takes place entirely on, like, a laptop and things like that, and it feels kind of gimmicky. But I think with what this film is trying to go for, it made the most sense to tell the story in this way. Right off the bat, I did not know that this was, like, based on a true story, which I think is very interesting. This particular story did happen. I don't think the character names are the same, but the story that happened here is one that happened, and I think it tells a story that's very important, because it's one that a lot of people don't know about. We focus on this girl. She is this journalist of sorts. She needs, like, this really good story when it comes to you know, basically trying to talk about ISIS and how all of these, you know, European women are constantly recruited and, you know, basically talked their way in through these guys that are seemingly very charming, and then their entire lives are just, like, destroyed because of it, and eventually, you know, they end up getting killed as a result. And I think that whole story is a very interesting one, how she dons this whole profile and things like that, and her entire, you know, plan is to try to expose this guy as much as she can, but instead she starts to actually fall for him, and it seems like she's contemplating whether or not to actually give up her life and actually consider, you know, going to Islam. And I thought that was a very interesting sort of way to look at it, because it feels like a very likely scenario that in fact did happen. Amy as a character, she's not dumb. Like, that's the thing. I've seen people say, oh, this character is so dumb, but I understood why she felt the way that she did, because she's expecting to meet this guy and for him to act a certain way, and he doesn't, and they actually are bonding a lot. They get very close, and it eventually gets to a point where she doesn't want to have to keep up this facade anymore, but she knows that she has to, because she knows of the life-threatening repercussions that could occur if she were to do that. And so it's a very interesting dilemma that our lead character is going through, and Valeen Kane, I think, does a really good job at just showcasing the emotion of this character. This is someone that has to try to keep her composure in very difficult situations, especially when it comes to the conversations, some of the conversations that her and Bilal really do have. You can see the difficulty that she's having here, and she just does a really great job at portraying that, especially once she eventually gets off that call. There were times where she had me fooled. Like, I forgot that she was, you know, playing this role, and that really speaks to how good of a performance she gives here. It just feels so natural in that way, and I think she does an incredible job. But by far, the star of this movie is Shazad Latif. I've seen him in things before, and he's given a good performance, but he has never been this good before. He is phenomenal in this movie, mainly because of just how charming he is in this role. I think Bilal is someone that, again, you can see why people are deceived by him. You can see why this is someone that has this ability to recruit these girls and like destroy their lives and things like that, and sort of like manipulate them. He just does such an amazing job in this film. I loved what he ended up doing here. I think that there were a lot more layers to his character. He could have easily just been this guy that's like, you know, this terrorist and he's doing all these terrible things, but he actually does have quite a few layers to him that I wasn't really expecting, and I thought he actually gave a really strong performance here. So I liked what he ended up doing in this film. I think that the chemistry that these two have, it works very, you know, they work very well together. And again, it's very hard to act in a film like this because you as an actor, especially, you know, are playing a character and you're, you know, acting out as that character on a call. You have to try to keep your composure as much as you can, and you can and I'm sure that Lateef was very disgusted by a lot of the things that Bilal, you know, tells Amy to partake in this movie, or, well, as she's playing in this film, Melody. And I thought that was very interesting, you know, what they ended up doing with him, and especially when that more darker side starts to come out, he really does kill it here, and I liked what he ended up doing in this film, and I felt very drawn to both of these characters as a result because of how good the two central performances were. Unfortunately, this movie is not perfect because the rest of the actors in this film are really not that good. Amy's partner, you know, boss that she has in this movie, Vic, Christine Adams, really is not that great here. Morgan Watkins as well, who plays her boyfriend Matt, I really was not impressed by. I wanted a lot more from him. It felt very much like he's just kind of here, so there's another conflict that she has, and there never really seems like a point where he has to be in this movie. I honestly felt like they could have cut him out entirely and the film would have been exactly the same. But other than that, like, I enjoyed this quite a bit. I think the directing from Timur Beacom Mambitov, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing his name wrong, like, I thought his directing was really strong here. He really has a firm grasp on, like, the story that he wants to tell, and I thought overall did a really good job with it. The ending as well, I thought was really well done, although I will say it was a little bit, it was a little bit abrupt, and there's, like, it's one of those movies where, like, text pops up on the screen. I would have liked to see that text actually, like, play out, but I understand why it didn't, just because of the nature of this film and whatnot. But overall, I think this is a very effective watch for sure. I think it's a film that really is going to have an impact on you. You'll go into it and you're expecting a certain type of film, but it really isn't that at all. It's a very riveting thriller that I think a lot of people are not going to be expecting, and it's one that I very much did enjoy quite a bit. It's not perfect. There definitely are some aspects that do bring it down. I do think it's a little too long as well. The third act really does kind of drag out. There feels like a point where it's about to end and there were like 20 more minutes remaining, but overall I liked this one quite a bit, significantly more than I was expecting. So B for profile. I think this was a very riveting thriller that covered a subject that I think is very important overall. The Killing of Two Lovers, I was really excited for, and this movie's very different from what I was expecting. The trailer kind of sells it as this, like, very dark sort of thriller, and it's really not that at all. This movie is honestly very naturalistic, and it's this heartbreaking drama about this guy that really is trying to do what he can to, like, keep his family together, but he himself feels so broken. And right off the bat, Clayne Crawford is phenomenal in this movie. He gives such a emotional performance, but he does it in a way that is very subtle. He's trying to keep it together as much as he can for his kids. He wants them to be happy. He doesn't want them to be part of the drama that's going on, and I think he really just nails every single emotional beat that this character is going through. I think he does a really good job with that in this movie, and the film really is, I think, at its best when it does focus squarely on that family drama and how desperate he is to try to keep up this facade, to try to make it seem like everything's okay. They can go back to being a normal family, even though there are inevitable changes that, are going to happen, that are going to irrevocably change the dynamic of the family forever. He is trying to prolong that from happening as much as he possibly can, and I think he does a really excellent job with that. The best scene for me, especially, involves like this fun day at the park that the kids are trying to have, and there's all these dilemmas that keep coming up. There's all these questions that they have. It's really was a standout moment for me, and really just was an example of this film at its best, and I think they did a really good job with that. And it's one of those movies where the dialogue especially is so deeply realistic that you forget you're watching a movie. It feels very strong, and in many aspects has the tools to be one of the best films of last year. Unfortunately, the movie is severely hampered by, I think, a couple issues that do honestly bring it down quite a bit. The biggest of being, aside from what I just told you, the rest of the movie is honestly very underwritten in quite a few aspects. There's this new guy that's come into the picture, as you know from the trailer, and we don't know a single fucking thing about him. We just know that Clayne Crawford doesn't really like this guy, doesn't like the fact that his wife is moving on, and wants this guy as far away from the family as possible. Other than that, he really just kind of feels like a plot device. They really don't do much of anything with him, and I found him to be a very disappointing character. I think they could have done a much better job, and I think the movie honestly would have been better if we did get scenes of seeing him and his ex-wife together, and how they're bonding, and how that kind of parallels to what Clayne Crawford's character is trying to do. I think they could have done a better job with that. And also, the reasoning behind the separation isn't really that clear. We don't really get a sense of what really caused them to have difficulties in their relationship, why this ended up happening. It's kind of similar to We Broke Up. It's not as severe as We Broke Up, because I still found myself mostly invested in what was going on, but I just needed more clarity, and it felt like we were just a bit too disconnected from the story, and maybe that's intentional because Clayne Crawford's character is feeling very disconnected from the family, but as a whole, I don't think they did a really great job with that, and the ending as well was just far too abrupt. I think there needed to be a little bit more in terms of the ending. It just didn't really feel satisfying. Like, the point where things were wrapping up, it didn't really feel like we were getting to that point, and when it did end, I was just kind of like, that's it. Like, I just really wanted a little bit more in terms of an ending, and it just wasn't really there. But again, the things that work really well in this movie really do work. Clayne Crawford's performance, his relationship with his family, those scenes I talked about where he's doing what he can to try to keep up this facade, I think that those are easily the strongest points of this movie. The directing here is also really well done, but again, I just need to stress, this movie is nothing like what the trailer made it seem like. It is the killing of two lovers is a lot more metaphorical than you're expecting. This is not this like dark sort of like, twisted drama. That's not what this movie really is at all. It's very devastating in that way, and it is very sad at points, but this like dark sort of drama, that's not really what this is. It's much more of just a very realistic and hard-hitting family drama that I do think overall works well for what it is. Could have been better in quite a few aspects, but because of like Clayne Crawford's performance and things like that, I overall can recommend this one. So B- for Killing of Two Lovers. Riders of Justice is perhaps the most overlooked movie of all of last year, aside from maybe a couple other contenders, but my god, I mean, this is a movie that I really wish was getting more attention, and I also wish I had made more of an effort to see when it first came out, because this really is such a special film. What I really like about this movie is that, seemingly this is just like a simple revenge film. Like, Mads Mikkelsen's wife was killed, and, at first he thinks that this was just an accident, and then, witnesses come along and proclaim that it wasn't, and he's gonna go out on this, like, revenge mission of sorts, but it's so much more than that. This is much more of a character drama, and it's that much better, I think, because of it. I mean, right off the bat, yeah, Mads Mikkelsen is incredible here, as he always is, but what I think he does a really good job with in this movie is how restrained of a performance he really is giving here. I mean, the character of Marcus is someone that you can tell is really trying to hold back any sort of grief that he's feeling, any sort of resentment that he's feeling. He really just kind of wants to get to the bottom of things, but it also has very much put a strain on his relationship with like his daughter and things like that. And eventually it comes to a point where he does fully let it out and really just shines throughout this entire movie, continues to show why he is one of the best actors working today. I really loved what he ended up doing here, but I gotta say, just as good as him is Nicolas Lycaz as Otto. Big fan of him in this movie. I liked what he did here a lot. I think he was a really big standout. He was actually an eyewitness to what ended up going down, and he feels just as regretful as Marcus really does, and I thought that his character was someone I really did find myself latching onto. In fact, all of these characters are really well written. They all have very interesting sort of dilemmas that they're going through and reasonings as to why they're on this mission, things that have happened to them before. The character of Lenart especially is probably, aside from Marcus, my other favorite character of this movie. I really liked what they did with him. He went in a very interesting direction that I wasn't expecting, and I thought that that was something that worked very well in this film. And the story itself, I think, is one that you really do find yourself invested in. You know, it starts off and there's this bicycle that's missing, and it all just kind of like comes back around to that. And I thought the way that they were able to, you know, implement all that into the story was really well done. But the other thing that impressed me is that this movie actually is really funny at points. There's a lot of comedy throughout this film, and it never feels forceful. They're able to integrate it in a way that just feels very natural to what's going on. These characters would banter in that way, and I found the comedy to be very consistent in this movie. There are a lot of funny jokes here, and I thought they did a really good job with that. And again, I think the characters as a whole are super well written here. The character of Matilda as well, his daughter, is very interesting to watch. I think Andrea Hake Gainsbourg gives a really good breakthrough performance here. I liked what she ended up doing in this movie. You can see that she really just wants to do what she can to try to get her dad back on a solid path. She can see that he sort of drifted away from who he used to be, and she wants to get back that relationship with him. There's just a lot of things I really do love when it comes to this movie. There are a lot of good like action set pieces as well. The only issues I really do have with it is the actual threats when it comes down to like what's going on here. Just feels a little bit underwhelming because the fact that they are extremely underdeveloped. We do not, and I mean we do not get a single scene with the villains of this movie until literally an hour into this film. And this movie is only like an hour and like, you know, 46-ish minutes long. So the fact that it takes like over an hour to get to that, it just doesn't really satisfy me. And by the time it got to it, it just felt like they were trying a little too hard to overcompensate for not really showing them. I think if they would have fleshed it out throughout the movie, it would have been a little bit better. I understand why they didn't because of the way the direction the movie ends up going. But I think if we had a little bit more insight into these characters and their motivation behind everything, you know, I would have felt even more attached to what was going on, because I didn't really feel like we had a clear understanding of why this ended up happening. Why did these characters do what they ended up doing? I don't think they did a really great job with that, but as a whole, I think this is a really well done film. I think it has a lot to say about grief and regrets, and I really love all of those themes that shine through very well here. I think this is a movie a lot of people are going to find themselves relating to. It's very funny, but it also is very heartwarming. So A- for Riders of Justice. Really wish more people were talking about this one. I love these Danish type films that Mads Mikkelsen has been partaking in lately between this and Another Round. I hope we continue to get more, because I think these are the films in which he shines the most, and I just really wish more people were talking about this one. I think it's a very special movie, and I very much think it's worth seeking out. So yeah, definitely, like, it's on Hulu now. Recommend this one a lot. By far one of the most underrated movies of last year. All right, I'll be honest, I don't remember Plan B very much at all. I remember that going into this film, I was kind of dreading it because I thought it looked really fucking obnoxious and things like that. And it's really not. I would not call this film obnoxious in really any way. I think there are moments that can get a little too, ridiculous in terms of the comedy, but I wouldn't really call it obnoxious. I think the actual plot makes sense in the context of the movie where, you have this student and her friend and they're trying to hunt down like this Plan B pill after something that ended up happening. I think that they do a pretty good job with that, and Victoria Morales and Kuho Verma are both really good in this movie. Morales in particular I liked quite a bit. I think that she was a really interesting character. I think that she did a really good job in this movie, made a really good impression, and I thought that they worked pretty well together. Unfortunately, beyond that though, I really do think this movie suffers quite a bit, and its biggest issue for me is that while there are a lot of moments that do work in terms of the comedy, a good majority of it really does fall flat, or I just had a really hard time figuring out how to really feel in terms of the comedy. I don't think that a lot of it really did work for me. And I also found these characters to just be very uninteresting throughout the majority of this. They don't really get into a lot of what they're going through until like the third act of this movie, and it just felt a little too late to like really dive deeper into that. I wish we would have had it like throughout the movie, because they do eventually have some kind of arc for these characters, but it doesn't really appear until literally like the third act in the movie. There's a scene with Sonny's mom especially that really felt like it came out of nowhere. It's a very like heartwarming scene, I understand that, but like it just did not feel earned in the slightest, and I don't think they did a great job with that. Other than that, I don't really remember a lot about this movie, to be honest with you. It's just kind of a throwaway comedy. Natalie Morales did an okay job directing, but it was a film I wanted a little bit more from. Wasn't a complete disaster, but wasn't really anything I'd recommend. C- for Plan B. For me, this is like a very throwaway comedy on Hulu. I know some people really like this one, but didn't really do much for me at all. Listen, with a movie like Endangered Species, like, you should be telling me, Kevin, you should have known what you were going to get with this going into it, and you might be right. But my god, this movie was disappointing to me. I expected this to be just a really ridiculous B-movie with, like, a family going to, like, this zoo and all of the animals attacking them. That's not what this is at all. There are some moments that are like that, and when they appear, they are pretty funny. But the majority of this movie is just a really boring and surprisingly schmaltzy family drama that did not work for me at all, and there's a couple reasonings. One, most of the acting here is absolutely atrocious, and I didn't really like anyone in this movie. Particularly Philip Winchester is just a really bad lead here. Jack as a character is so unlikable. He treats the way he treats his family especially, I was not a fan of, and I don't really like what they were trying to do with him. I think the characters themselves are just so deeply unlikable in this film. There's nobody I really found myself latching onto, particularly the way that like Philip Winchester's character treats his son really just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I didn't really like it very much at all. And in general, I just found these characters just not people that I liked following for, like, almost, like, 2 hours. Like, that's not something I really like seeing in this movie at all. There really aren't any, like, good performances here. And like I said, like, when those moments come up with those, like, horrible-looking CGI animals, then it's fun. But, like, aside from that, that's really just like a fraction of this movie. The majority of it is just really boring to watch. I thought that the characters we're following were not people I enjoyed watching, and Jerry O'Connell, someone that, he's like on the poster of this movie, does not show up until literally the third act, and he doesn't really do much of anything here. I don't have much else to say. It's not very good. It's like it's a direct-to-DVD film. You could have said, I don't know what to expect, but like, I should know what to expect going in. But when the trailer promises like a really ridiculous fun movie, that looked like it could be like a really fun like guilty pleasure for me, and it turns out to be just like a really boring like family drama full of like these really unlikable characters, like, yeah, it is definitely going to upset me a bit that it wasn't what I expected. But yeah, not really much else to say. Don't watch this one. Next movie. It's also like really self-serious, and I didn't understand why. It's like the movie doesn't want to have any fun with itself. It just wants to focus on these characters and then brooding over God knows what. It's like, who goes, and it's one of those films where, like, I understand that this is supposed to be a direct-to-DVD film, so I should know what to expect. But generally, I watched this movie and I'm just wondering, like, who is the target audience? Like, who watches a movie called Endangered Species that sounds like this like disaster film, and instead it's focused on like this really boring family that is just really just not likable in any way, like has nothing relatable, nothing to latch onto. Like, who wants to watch that? And I just don't understand it. I don't understand why the movie is centered on that. It doesn't really work very much at all. It's just bad. It's really bad. Spirit Untamed, a movie that came to theaters and yet should have probably gone to Netflix while fucking Luca went on Disney+. What a weird world we're living in. Why did this movie come to theaters? That I could not tell you. What I can say is that this movie is really not very good. Right off the bat, I don't think this film does a really good job at trying to... Now, I will say right off the bat, like, the original Spirit I did watch before this movie is actually a pretty good film. It does a good job of telling this story about this horse and, you know, sort of like different decades of what he has gone through. It's told almost entirely without dialogue, and it's almost entirely throughout, like, the horse's perspective. But I really like that film quite a bit. It's a lot darker than what DreamWorks usually does, and this film has absolutely nothing to do with that whatsoever. In fact, I don't know why this movie is called Spirit Untamed, aside from taking place in the same, like, time period. Like, I don't really understand why, this is even, you know, the same type of property. The whole thing just kind of feels like some mediocre, like, Nickelodeon TV movie that, like, is getting, like, it's like setting up, like, a pilot of sorts to, like, a longer show, which there already is a show. It's on Netflix. It has terrible animation. I watched, like, literally 2 minutes of it. I could not get through more than like 2 minutes. And this is definitely a little bit more tolerable than that, but not really saying all that much, because I really have no idea why this is a theatrical film at all. I'm honestly kind of struggling to figure out why that is. I mean, Isabel Merced is good here. She's a great actress, and she continues to show that here. I think Lucky does, you know, is not a very interesting character, very generic with what, you know, with what she's going through, but I think Isabel Merced overall does a pretty good job in this film. Jake Gyllenhaal, you know, he's good for what he has. He actually sings in this movie, which was interesting. I don't know why this was the first animated film that Jake Gyllenhaal took on, but, I mean, he's not terrible here. He's Jake Gyllenhaal. He's kind of incapable of giving a bad performance for the most part. But, like, there really isn't much going on here to really latch onto. There's this group of friends that Lucky comes across, especially, that I just did not like at all. I usually really like McKenna Grace, but she annoyed the hell out of me in this movie. They're trying so hard to make her, like, the comedic relief, and it just did not work here very much at all for me. Julianne Moore really doesn't have much to do here either. Again, I don't really have much to say about this one. The animation isn't like the worst until you think about the fact that this is a theatrical movie. It really does leave a lot to be desired at the end of the day. It's a film that very much is made just kind of for kids and no one else. I don't really think this is going to cater to really anyone. It has the vibe of like a straight to DVD movie throughout the majority of it, and that's kind of all it is. So why am I even talking about it? I don't know. I saw this in theaters. Should I have seen this in theaters? Probably not, but I did. I'm talking about it. It's not very good. C-. I don't really have much else to say. Let's move on. So look, I talked about before how I'm not really going to be discussing movies that I talked about in my worst list, but I didn't really talk about this movie at length, The Misfits, so I'm going to do so now. Look, this is the kind of movie that, like, back in the 90s and the 2000s came out, like, all the time. These, like, really stupid action comedies with, like, a bunch of random actors thrown together, saying the most ridiculous dialogue, going on the most ridiculous missions. That's very much what this film is, and it's really unfortunately not much more than that. I will say, I think the best part of this movie for me easily is Hermione Corfield, and she's always good. Like, she always gives a strong performance in really anything that she's in, and she was really giving the only performance in this movie that felt better than what this movie could have been. Pierce Brosnan very much knows what kind of movie he's in. He's not really doing much to elevate it. Nick Cannon is the narrator of this movie for some reason, and I honestly have no idea why. He's not nearly as major of a part of the film as like you would expect him to be. Yeah, he's part of the team, but he's he's nowhere on the level of like Pierce Brosnan. He's no bigger than say like Jamie Chun or any of the, or Jamie Chun or Rami Jabbar, any of the other like members of the team in this movie. I don't know why Nick Cannon was given like the responsibility to narrate here. It just feels like a very odd choice to me. And look, I love Nick Cannon, but the narration does not work in this movie. It really just feels out of place, and I just don't think they did a very good job with it. There's a lot of really terrible action sequences here. Again, this is just really like a what you see is what you get kind of film. There's some fun moments here and there. Tim Roth is utterly wasted as the villain. I really like Tim Roth as an actor, but he really does not have anything to do in this movie at all. D+ for The Misfits. Again, it's not like one of the worst things I've ever seen, but it's pretty bad overall. There isn't really much to say about this one. So The Amusement Park as a film, I think you need to go into knowing a couple things. One, this is not really a narrative film, and that's something that I think the trailer is very deceiving with. The trailer kind of makes it look like it's this very like surreal kind of like horror film, and there's a lot of like weird shit going on, and there is to at some points, but this really is like an information film about elder abuse and the disrespect that a lot of elderly people usually do face, and I think it is pretty effective in that. The problem is, for me, it's a little light on story. There's not a lot going on here in terms of a story. There are some moments that really do work. I like the social commentary this film has on like ageism and things like that. I think there's some really interesting ideas that are in this movie. It also has like such a like very eerie and unsettling vibe, the kind that really only George A. Romero could have pulled off. That being said, I can very much see why it took him so long to release this movie, because for the time this movie came out, yeah, it definitely delves into some really heavy stuff, and I think now this film is a little bit more relevant. It gives you that sense of claustrophobia, really kind of puts you into the minds of the people that we're following in this movie, and I think it's good that this was finally released, because the themes and messages are so much relevant today, and I feel like very little has really progressed, especially, the ways that the younger people treat some of the older characters in this movie. I mean, it's just absolutely disgraceful to watch, and this film really does dive into not just the disrespect, but also the fear that these characters live in. I mean, there's so little that they live in a world that they barely understand. They don't feel like they fit into like society and things like that, and I think that's something that is done very well here. And look, I will say the beginning of the movie was very jarring for me, because I was very taken aback by the way they literally open this up with like a monologue that this is a PSA for elder abuse, and it's very important to like recognize those things. They end it in the same way. I do think the movie should have been a bit longer to like really get its point across, because it does feel a bit brief at points, and it sometimes it feels like they're kind of just like repeating some things, but I think for what this is, it is pretty effective. I think it gets its message across quite well. Again, I just think this is a movie that's very important to know going in. This is not really a narrative feature. It is much more of this PSA, but it's a very effective one at that, and I definitely would recommend it. B- for this one. I think is a really unsettling vibe throughout, and really did a lot more than I expected to. Very different movie, I think, than what you're expecting, but a very interesting one at that. Peter Rabbit 2: The Runaway is about as unnecessary of a sequel as I really did expect it to be, and in some aspects, I do think this one is a little worse than the first movie, because the first movie, if you remember, I actually kind of liked. I thought there was something that was pretty charming about it. I thought it had a nice little story in there. I've infamously said that it was a deep film. I never said that. I want to get that right out of the way, because a lot of people like to say that I did. That's not something that I said. I said the movie had good character development. The second one, though, is really not very good. I will say there are some things they try to do differently here. This one is a lot more meta, which a lot of films I feel like have been doing lately. They've been trying to pull off this more sort of meta edge to it, and it doesn't really work here, I have to say, because the film itself is very counterproductive, because a lot of the things the movie is kind of calling itself out for, it really doesn't do much to, like, subvert our expectations or differentiate itself. And you may say, well, that's kind of the point, because it's a meta sequel. But the problem is the movie is just far too predictable to really do anything interesting when it comes to this story, when it comes to Peter and what he's going through, how, you know, he feels like he maybe shouldn't be doing this anymore, and people don't really like him being all mischievous, and he feels like he needs to run away. It's like, we know exactly where this is going to go from the second that it starts, and it just isn't particularly fun to watch. James Corden is really just kind of going through the motions at this point, and I just don't think that he is really all that great in this role. I will say Rose Byrne gets a little bit more to do this time around, and I think that she actually did have some good moments in this movie. I liked what she did end up doing, and I think there is a kind of some fun moments with her, you know, trying to make this book and making sure that this book is done in such a way, but it's constantly getting ruined by David Oyelowo's character. That part of the movie was a little bit more interesting, but as a whole, this just kind of feels like a waste. They really don't do much of anything to justify its existence. Sometimes we're literally repeating the same exact beats as the first movie, especially when it comes to McGregor and Peter. Like, it seems like these two have made amends. I don't know why they are at each other's throats again. It just feels very repetitive in that way. Really no reason for this to exist. I'm not shocked that they just kind of like threw this into theaters, you know, didn't really market it that much. Not shocking to me they end up doing that. It's not like a terrible movie or anything, but it's just a sequel that I don't really think needs to exist at all. I honestly found it pretty dull in a lot of aspects, so C for Peter Rabbit 2. Not really much else to say. Flashback is easily one of the most overlooked movies of last year. Right off the bat, Dylan O'Brien is terrific in this movie. I think this is one of his best performances to date. I really like what he ends up doing here. I think the character of Frederick Fitzel is a very hard one to get right, because this is a character that is going through a bit of a mental decline in his life, and you have to try to portray it in a way that doesn't feel like offensive or anything like that. And I think he rides the line between that pretty well, because not only are we seeing this more sort of, you know, erratic side of him, we're also contrasting that with who he used to be. And I think through and through, Dylan O'Brien gives a really strong performance here. Fred is someone you do find yourself attached to, and I think he does do a really good job in this movie. And I also like a lot of what this movie is trying to go for when it comes to this story. I think it's a very interesting one. It's really one of those films, like, you kind of have to pay attention to every bit of dialogue, because a lot of it is very important. There's a lot of directions they go that I found to be very interesting. This is a film that you can endlessly dissect, because there's so many things that happen throughout this movie. There's so many moments where I thought I had it figured out, and then it would take a bit of a turn and it would go in a different direction, and I found that to be very interesting. When it comes to this girl that he, you know, keeps remembering, you know, she's vanished in high school. Is she real? What's really going on there? There's this drug that he's taking and things like that, and, you know, you're not really sure what's real and what's not, and that can at points be a little frustrating. But by the time the movie does end, it actually becomes really heartwarming, and I think it becomes a really tender story about, you know, kind of like coping with tragedies in your life, and doing what you can to, like, finally get that clarity. I don't really want to say much else than that, but I really liked what they ended up doing when it came to the third act of this movie. That being said, there is a lot about this film that I think I still don't fully understand. I do need to give this one a second watch at some point. Micah Monroe is also not in this movie enough. I really just felt like her character, they needed to do a little little bit more with her. I didn't find the chemistry between them to be quite as strong as it needed to be, and I don't know if that was intentional or not. I think they needed to do a little bit better of a job when it came to that overall. But as a whole, I really dug this one. I think it's a much different film. It's a film that I think people aren't really going to expect. I think you go into a movie like this and you kind of expect it to be just like this typical sort of direct to streaming film, but that's not really what this is at all. It's something that's a lot more complex than that, and I really do appreciate the filmmakers for going there. The cinematography is also really cool here. There's a lot of interesting things they do with it. So B for Flashback. I wish I had a lot more to say, but like I said, it's been a while since I've seen some of these, so I'm trying to remember them to the best of my recollection, but I definitely do recommend this one. False Positive is very disappointing because I think there are a lot of interesting ideas that this film is trying to go for. Right off the bat, I really do like the premise of this movie where, you know, this mother kind of becomes pregnant out of nowhere and she starts to realize that there's something weird going on when it comes to this fertility doctor and she wants to know more about him. That's a really good premise. There's a lot that you really can do with that, and for a little bit, it is really interesting. And a lot of that is due to Lana Glazer's performance, who really does kill it in this movie, I must say. I haven't really seen her take on something quite like this before, but she really does prove she is an actress that can do more than just comedies and things like that. And I really like what she ended up doing in this movie. I kind of want to see her do more films such as this one. I think that she gives a really effective performance here. And there are some moments here that, like I said, are very unsettling, very creepy. But it does take a long time for anything to happen in this movie, and a lot of the time the scares are just not very effective because there's a large abundance of jump scares in this movie, and a lot of them just don't really feel like they're doing much of anything. It gets very repetitive after a while, and I don't think they did a very good job with that. But also the characters we're following here are just not really that interesting. We don't know a lot about Lucy as a character other than she just really wants a baby. She's been trying to conceive with her husband for like 2 years, and now she finally has a baby, and what's she gonna do with it? Like, there's not really a lot more to latch on to. Justin Theroux, forget about it. There's like absolutely nothing to him, and Pierce Brosnan is not in this movie enough. You know, he's supposed to be like the lingering sort of sinister presence that's in this film, and I just don't really feel like they did enough with him here. So already that was a big issue for me, but then you get to the third act when we start to get more of an idea of what's going on, and the entire movie comes crashing down as a result. The twist to this movie is so laughably stupid that I honestly can't believe that they ended up leaving it in. It's one of those twists where you swear this is a dream sequence. This is not actually happening. This is too stupid. There's no way they'd actually go to this particular direction, but they do, and it does not work for a second. There's nothing they do to convince you that this actually makes sense. There's nothing they do to really make it seem like the film has actually earned this twist. Where they go with a lot of these characters, they lose really any sense of interest that they had, and by the time the movie was over, I just found this film to be a giant waste of time. There's so much missed potential here. They could have done so much more when it comes to this film, and it really does not work very much at all. Anyone who's expecting like a Rosemary's Baby type film, that is not really what this is at all. Instead, it's just a really thrown together horror film that I think they needed to do a lot more with. I expect more from A24. I expect more from the director of this film, John Lee. I think that he did have an interesting style to this movie, but as a whole, I mean, this was just very disappointing. I really wanted a lot more from this, but by the end, I just really couldn't stand it all. So C- for False Positive. Sophia Bush also completely pointless in this movie. There really is no reason for her to be here at all. Yeah, just really let down by this one. Werewolves Within is so much fun. This is the kind of movie that kind of sneaks up on you. I think people are going to go into this movie, and what they're going to expect is kind of like this Fargo-esque type film, and that is essentially what this is. It's very Coen Brothers-like in the way that it centers on a lot of just really quirky and weird characters, and they're all placed in this environment. But the movie goes, I think, far beyond that. I would very much compare this to something like a Knives Out, but like a horror horror film in that way. And I think that the movie is very effective in that. You know, what I think works so well about this film is that the first, I would say, 30 to 40 minutes, it's really us just following a bunch of different storylines, whether it's not Finn Wolfhard, Sam Richards. I don't know why I said Finn Wolfhard, because his character's name is Finn Wheeler. That's why I said Finn Wolfhard. Whether it's Sam Richardson and him, being assigned to this case and trying to figure out if there is a werewolf and things like that, or we're focusing on like Michaela Watkins' character who's going through her own sort of dilemma, or we're focusing on like this gay couple that's like really fun to watch. There's a lot of different characters in this movie, and when they eventually all come together, that is really when this movie does shine. When these characters are now stuck in this room and they're all accusing each other and all this stuff is going on at once, it is just an absolute blast to watch. The comedy is also just absolutely hysterical here. I found myself laughing at so many points in this movie. I loved what they ended up doing with it, and so many great performances here too. Sam Richardson is such a good comedic actor, and he really does prove it here. I think he honestly does work best when he is the straight man. I talked about how like the Tomorrow War, for example, they tried to make him the comedic relief and it really didn't work. This is an example of him, I think, working at his best. He's best when he's playing the guy that is a little bit more oblivious to what's going on and he has to react to a lot of these crazy situations. I think he does a really good job with that. I also was a pretty big fan of Melina Weintraub. I've never seen her much before, but I really like the performance that she gives in this movie. I think that she is a lot of fun here, and their bond is one that you really do kind of find yourself latching onto in this film. Michaela Watkins and Glenn Flesher are really big standouts here too. Harvey Guilan, I mean, just a really fun cast of characters overall. Josh Rubin's directing, I think, is also really well done. He really brings a lot of comedy to this film, but also does have a bit of this like mystery angle that I think he does a really good job with as well. Really, everyone has some sort of goal in this for why they're so like involved in this mystery, and like I said, when all those characters are together and they're kind of stuck under one roof, I think that's when this movie really does succeed. And the third act honestly really threw me for a loop. There's a point where you think you know where this is going, and then the movie lets out one more twist, and it just really brings the whole thing together in like a nice little bow, and I really love the way they ended this movie off. So yeah, I think this is one that not enough people really did see. I think it's a really entertaining film, but also has a lot of really great comedy, a lot of great performances here. Definitely is one of the better video game movies. I didn't know this was based off a video game, but certainly is one of the better ones that I've seen. Yeah, pretty big fan of this one overall. A- for Werewolves Within. I think this one really went under a lot of people's radar, and it's unfortunate because I really do think it is something special. No Sudden Move is yet another Steven Soderbergh film, but it definitely feels a bit different from other things that he's done. This is way more of like this sort of gangster heist film, and I think overall he does a pretty good job with that. All of the cast here is really good. Don Cheadle and Benicio del Toro, I think, work very well together here. I really enjoyed their sort of dynamic in this movie with kind of like what they're going through. The movie also really does a good job of like focusing on all of these characters and like the different reasons they have for getting into this whole scheme. I think that's something that the movie does do a pretty good job with here when it comes to their heist and what they really need to do to like get themselves out of this. I thought that was really well done, and there are some directions this movie takes that I really wasn't expecting. That being said, I think the movie is a little too crowded in terms of characters. There are just some here that I didn't feel got the proper focus that they really needed, and I think they could have done a little bit more with them. There's some cameos that were honestly really surprising to me that I wasn't expecting to see in this movie, and I thought that was pretty cool. Steven Soderbergh's directing is still really good here. I don't have a ton to say about this one because it has been a little bit since I watched it, but I remember really liking it quite a bit. I think it's one that not enough people really did watch, and again, I said it in my Kimmy review, and I'll say it again here. As long as Steven Soderbergh just continues pumping movies out, I will be a fan. Not all of them have been great, but I appreciate the fact that he is consistently trying to deliver something different every single time, and I think he definitely did succeed with this one. So B for No Sudden Move. I think, again, there are just a couple things that do bring it down, but overall, I think this one is really well done. Hi. So yeah, an even more awkward cut to not a video but an audio file, because in the midst of editing this video, even though I had forgotten two movies and went back and talked about those two movies, I realized there were still three films I had forgotten to talk about, so I might as well just bring them up now. The first of which is a movie that I can't believe I forgot about, because this movie really surprised me, and that's Till Death. You look at the poster, and I'm gonna try to keep these as short as I can, by the way, because I know this is like awkward listening to it in fucking podcast form all of a sudden, but you look at the poster, looks like a really like stupid, like straight to, streaming type movie, and it's really not that at all. This was actually a very surprising film. Megan Fox especially is fantastic here. You totally get on board with her character, the relationship that she's been in. You want to see her get out of this relationship because you see the difficulties that she's really had, and while it's kind of freeing to see, what ends up happening to her, at the same time you see what she's really like gotten herself caught up into, and I think she just does such an amazing job throughout this entire film. The movie actually spends a lot more time on that specific marriage and just how unhappy she was in it, and it really helps later on when what ends up happening does happen, because you want to see her get out of it. So I think all of that is very strong here. There's also some really good action in this movie. There's a lot of tension and things like that. I think S.K. Dale does a really good job directing this film. Very riveting thriller. My only real issue is the villains are just kind of nothing here. Like, there's really nothing to them. There's never they do spend time on them in this film, but it's very like one note type motivations, really not a ton to latch onto there. But other than that, this film really did surprise me. It's a lot better than I expected it to be, so definitely a B for Till Death. I was kind of, like I said, expecting like a very run-of-the-mill type thriller here, and it's a lot better than that for sure. I think this one was honestly pretty overlooked. Definitely recommend it for sure. Gunpowder Milkshake is really, I think, frustrating, because there are some things that really do work well here. Right off the bat, the action sequences are so well done in this movie. There are a lot of really entertaining action sequences throughout this film that I very much did enjoy, not just ones that you've seen in the trailer, and I think all of them do work very well here. The direction here is really good from Novot's Papa Shoot Shadow. I think that they just have such an interesting sort of vision, and I like what he ended up accomplishing in this film. I really like the direction that he went with in this movie. Unfortunately, as a whole, though, it just feels a bit too derivative and generic to, like, really do much of anything for me. I think the premise here is, like, simple enough, and there isn't anything that's, like, terrible about this movie that, like, really brings it down. But it's just mainly due to the fact that everyone acting-wise is really killing it here. Karen Gillan especially has honestly never been better. She owns every single second of this role. You understand why she's in the position that she's in. You kind of see how she got herself into this role, and you really do buy into it well. I very much do buy Karen Gillan as this badass of sorts, and I think they do a really good job with that. And Chloe Coleman, Angela Bassett, Michelle Yeoh, Paul Giamatti, they're all really good here. I will say, Lena Headey, I thought was honestly kind of miscast in this film. I get her character, but I just didn't really buy into her in this movie. There's a lot of tension between her and Karen Gillan, and I just don't really think she sold it all that well. I think that she just seemed a little bit, like she was going through the motions in this movie, and I wasn't super into what she ended up doing here. But the thing that really holds this movie back is the script here, which I just found to be really dull. I think that there's a lot of stuff that could work very well when it comes to this movie. The actual story is one that I actually was kind of into at first, because I think initially we do a pretty good job of diving into her character and her traumatic past and how she really did get into this. But after this one flashback, we don't really get much more from that. And once we get more into the mother and daughter story, it just becomes a bit forced, because I don't think they focused enough on it, and it's just not super well written with the directions that they decide to go with that, and I don't think they did a really strong job with that at all in this movie. I also felt that this was a film that's really just kind of concerned with like getting to the next action sequence, unfortunately. Really doesn't try to take the time to like dive deep into these characters, and I think one of the biggest issues for sure is the sisterhood itself. The group, again, the acting is really good from all of the women that are in the sisterhood, but as a whole, they just feel very underutilized. We don't really get a sense of the team that they're supposed to be. They're very entertaining in a lot of moments, but I just felt like they needed a lot more development to them because their characters just didn't really stick out all that much to me. And, you know, this is a film that we've been getting a lot of lately, these type of like John Wick type, you know, action films we've been getting. I just needed a lot more because the visuals are there, the action sequences are there for sure. There's a good dynamic with some of the characters, especially Karen Gillan and Chloe Coleman. But as a whole, I just needed a lot more from this movie, and it just didn't really deliver in the way that I wanted to. So again, it's yet another Netflix film that I just felt really did kind of miss the mark overall and could have been a lot better. So C+ for Gunpowder Milkshake. I honestly was really looking forward to this one. I think it had some really interesting ideas behind it, but it just didn't fully utilize everything that it needed to. Not to mention the villains are extremely underdeveloped in this movie. You really don't get any sense of who they are or, you know, what their whole sort of mission is. There's a really good scene with Karen Gillan in the villains, but it's more about the action sequence and the actual writing. As a whole, I just felt this was not quite as good as it needed to be, and I think that's what ultimately did bring this one down. Pig is every bit as good as you really have heard. I mean, what I really love about this movie is that you go into it and you kind of expect this to be this revenge, you know, thriller of sorts where Nicolas Cage is getting revenge on someone for taking his pig, but it is so much more than that. This is really a film about someone that is dealing with grief and a little too caught up in the past, and that's kind of his character as a whole. There's a reasoning why he cares so much about this pig. It's not just because of the fact that he's become this truffle hunter. It's because this is where he has been, this is how he has been coping through a very difficult time within his life. And Nicolas Cage is fucking amazing here. This is easily one of the best performances I've ever seen him give, mainly because of just how restrained he is in this role. I mean, this is a guy who is going through a lot in terms of emotion. He has a very traumatic past, and the movie does take a while to fully flesh all of that out, but the more we get a peek behind that curtain, the more Cage's performance really does shine through. Everyone's talked about, like, the critics seeing this movie, so I'm not going to get into it too much, but that whole scene is just absolute perfection when you start to see more of him potentially going down this path, because he used to be a chef himself, and there's a lot of specifics that he wants, and he feels like people aren't really, you know, delivering that. I think he does a really great job. Like I said, a lot of the grieving aspects of this movie are really well utilized overall. And Alex Wolff's character, he's kind of going through a lot as well, because he has a lot of pressure from his father, and you can kind of see what he's going through in this film. And I think that their dynamic is one you really do find yourself latching onto in this movie, because seemingly there's not a lot that's similar, but they actually do have quite a lot of similarities that they're both going through, and I think the movie does dive into that pretty well here. Michael Sarnowski's directing is also really good in this movie. He really does take the time to center on this conflict. I think his dramatic beats work very well here. He doesn't try to overplay it to the point where it just feels kind of schmaltzy. The film just feels very natural in that way, and I think that's something that I really did enjoy when it came to his directing. I will say, I think the movie's a little too short. I honestly could have gone for another 20 or 30 minutes to, like, really get a sense of what this character was dealing with, and I think the first, like, 20 to 30 minutes is a little bit slow. Once the actual plot settles in, I think that's when this gets really great. But other than that, I think this is a very effective film. It's every bit as good as people have really been saying. B+ for Pig. It's really a damn shame that, like, Nicolas Cage didn't get more, like, Oscar attention for this movie, because this is definitely one of his strongest performances yet. There's a lot that this movie did that I really wasn't expecting. Just a really, really good film overall. It's one that I honestly really do kind of want to see again, just for what you're going to get out of it. It has so much more to say than you're expecting, and I think that's something that really snuck up on a lot of people. So yeah, definitely deserves all the hype it's been getting. Okay, once again, I apologize for the drop in quality, but the next film we got to talk about is Snake Eyes. I can't believe I fucking forgot about this film. Like, this is probably one of the bigger movies I'm speaking about, and I literally forgot to talk about it. But honestly, I feel like that says a lot just how forgettable this movie is. I saw this in theaters. It's the next G.I. Joe film. Right off the bat, who really wanted another G.I. Joe film? I feel like the other two weren't that great at all, so like I don't really understand why this was a thing, but I was hoping that this could maybe, give a new sort of purpose to this franchise, kind of like, breathe new life into it, and it really doesn't at all. This is a very unnecessary film pretty much all around. The main reason for this is because Snake Eyes as a character just isn't particularly interesting. He honestly is kind of unlikable throughout this movie, and Henry Golding is good here, but the problem is he's really saddled with playing just such an unlikable asshole throughout the majority of this movie. Meanwhile, the character that you're supposed to dislike in Andrew Koji, you actually feel a lot more sympathetic for in this film because of, what he's really doing. You understand the direction he ends up going in. I think he easily is the strongest part of this entire movie. I really found myself liking his character quite a bit, and I think they did some really good stuff with him. But practically the rest of this movie, there's just so much missed potential here. Samara Weaving is in this film, but she's really in it for like 10 to 15 minutes, and the majority of it is just to give some sort of connection to the G.I. Joe universe, because aside from that, there really is no reason to call this a G.I. Joe movie whatsoever. There's like a thing they shoehorn in at the end, but really, this could have been its own thing. It very much could have been just like a standalone action film in that way. As is, it's really not that great. The action is really not filmed well here at all. It's a very bland movie to look at points. I didn't hate myself watching it or anything, but it is so forgettable in the moment. Yeah, definitely a C for Snake Eyes. Has some okay moments for sure, but overall, I really don't have too much to say about this one. Very much just like a forceful type prequel that was trying to resurrect a dead franchise and really didn't do anything to justify its existence overall. I don't see us getting any sort of continuation, nothing. I think this is just very, very forgettable. Jolt is another one I feel like nobody has seen. Like, I literally saw nobody talk about this movie. It got released onto Amazon Prime, and this is a movie that I feel like would typically come out in, like, January, and I was expecting the absolute worst from, because it's Kate Beckinsale, she's in another action film, and I didn't really expect much of anything from this, and for a little bit, I'm not gonna lie, I actually was kind of digging it, because the movie doesn't take itself all that seriously. It knows that this is kind of ridiculous. The idea that she has these, like, anger management problems, and, when she gets upset, it, like, causes these, like, electricity to, like, jolt out of her is a really funny idea. There's a great scene early on where she's at a restaurant and she's really annoyed by something that's been going on, and it just causes her to, like, rage out, and stuff like that I thought was actually really funny. They did a lot of fun stuff with that early on in the movie, and pulling someone like Bobby Cannavale into it and sort of seeing her, try to stay as composed as she really can, I thought was a really fun idea at first. And I think the first, like, 30-ish minutes of this movie, like I said, I actually was kind of digging. The problem is, the further we go with this film, the more it just kind of turns into basically just a generic action movie, and that's when I really started to lose interest into what was going on. I think when the comedy works, it honestly did work quite well, but it's a little too infrequent for me. The movie starts to become a lot more just of what you're kind of expecting, and I don't think they did a very good job with that. Jai Courtney is in this, and he really doesn't do that great of a job. As usual, he just is not really that strong of an actor, and I didn't really like what he ended up doing in this movie. And his character is exactly what you expect for the most part. There's a certain direction they go with him that I saw coming from a mile away and wasn't even, remotely shocking to me. So I don't think they did a very good job with that. Bobby Cannavale's character as well just isn't particularly interesting at all. And Stanley Tucci had the potential to be a very interesting character, but again, where they went with him was just so predictable in this film. I don't think that any of the writing here was really all that strong. It really just felt like a movie where they were just kind of making it up as they went along. There is narration in this film that at first feels kind of out of place from Susan Sarandon, and then they do something with her where she actually does appear in this movie, and it does not work in the slightest. Like, I get what they were trying to go for, but it really did not work in this film. I think Tanya Wexler's directing is also kind of all over the place. Like I said, it started off as like this really sort of like fun comedy that didn't take itself too seriously, but towards the third act, I mean, it really just kind of becomes, it really did just become very generic, and I don't think it really worked in the way that it needed to. I will say, Kate Beckinsale is actually really good here. Like, I think this is the kind of role that really does work for her. You can tell that she actually is having a lot of fun. She's not just reading lines off a script, and I liked what she ended up doing in this movie. This is definitely not like Underworld or something like that, where she's clearly not into what's going on. No, she seems like she's having fun, and that's something I did overall enjoy. A lot of the action sequences, though, are honestly really cheap to watch. There's a car chase especially that was honestly terrible to watch and really took me out of the movie with the way that it was filmed and things like that. The cinematography just really leaves a lot to be desired here. As a whole, this really does feel like a movie that would have come out like in the early 2000s and probably would have been really cheesy and probably could have turned out to be a little bit better than what we did get here. But again, I found myself honestly pretty frustrated by the time this movie ended, because I think it actually did have a pretty strong start, but the way it ended, it just didn't really amount to much of anything, and the movie itself didn't really get much traction. I didn't really hear anybody talk about this movie, so it just kind of feels like this throwaway experience, and it's unfortunate because I think it actually started off pretty okay, but by the end I just didn't really care that much about it. So C for Jolt. I think it had some fun ideas, but as a whole didn't do really much of anything for me. Sweetwater, another movie that's very different from what I was expecting. You go into this film and it starts off and you think that this is going to be very much a film where it is Matt Damon's character and him trying to like bail his daughter out of jail after what's happened to her, and that's part of the movie. But it really is only like a fraction of the movie when it comes to this film. I think a lot of this movie, and what I really liked about this film, a lot of this film is actually devoted to Matt Damon understanding like French culture and things like that. He is very he feels very out of touch with what's going on. He kind of feels like a fish out of water in that way, and the movie actually does take a lot of time to show him slowly warming up to what's going on, thanks to a very genuine relation between him and Camille Cotton's character that honestly turns out to be very sweet. I like seeing him getting to learn the French culture, him sort of warming up to it all. I think the movie does do a really good job with that. The movie is like 2 hours long, and there are points where it drags, but I appreciate the fact that it is as long as it is, because it really does give you time to flesh out Matt Damon going through, this time and really, warming up to the culture. I think all of that is very well done here. What does bring this movie down, honestly, is the subplot with Abigail Breslin. It just doesn't really fit in this film as a whole. There are moments that do work, but as a whole, whenever the movie tries to go back to it, it just feels very, underwritten in that way. You don't feel quite as drawn to it as you do with other aspects of this movie and what they're trying to go for. I think Abigail Breslin's good here, but she's not really in this movie enough at all. And I know that it was loosely based on Amanda Knox, and there was a bunch of controversy because they didn't really do a good job of telling her story and things like that, and she wasn't involved in anything, and so that was something that she was really pissed about. And if you've seen the Amanda Knox documentary, this is someone who was wrongfully accused of something and things like that, and I get why she is upset for sure, because they really don't do a good job when it comes to Abigail Breslin's character. They don't really dive into her hardships or anything like that. But again, when it focuses on Matt Damon and him trying to, become more attuned to the French culture, developing this whole new life, I think that part of the movie is really good. And Matt Damon is honestly really good in this movie. This is probably one of his best performances he's given in quite a bit. Tom McCarthy's directing is pretty good here for the most part. It's cool to see him direct another movie after Spotlight. I feel like this is more in vein with that. I know he did Timmy Failure last year, but I think this is much more closer to what he needs to be doing as a director. So overall, yeah, I really like this one quite a bit. It's got a really good score here too. I do think the movie drags in some aspects, and there are some moments that feel a bit underwritten. There's some time jumps that I wasn't a big fan of, but as a whole, much different movie than I was expecting. Definitely a B for Sweetwater. I think a lot of people are not going to be expecting what this turns out to be, but I think by the time it ends, it really becomes this sort of like charming and sweet movie that I think is really going to sneak up on you, and I don't think enough people really saw this one, so yeah, definitely recommend this one overall. Oh my god, we're back to terrible audio again, and I promise this will be the last time you have to deal with this, or you have to, witness an abrupt cut in the video to audio format. But the last movie we're talking about here is Censor. Again, another movie, I don't know how I left this off the list, because this film is so innovative in the way that it's done. The whole movie is pretty much like an ode to like video nasties and things like that, and kind of showing like the darker side of them, which I really didn't know too much about this, the harmful sort of effects that this can have on someone, but also the idea of the lines being blurred between reality and fantasy, I think is very well done here. And the lead performance in this movie, I liked quite a bit. I think she does a really incredible job here. Naima Algar, I think is how you pronounce her name. I really liked her in this movie. You want to see her fulfill this quest, but you're also not entirely sure what is going on in this film, and that is both a pro and a con. It's a pro because you are so disoriented that you are just so you're so disoriented by what's going on. You at the same time are so invested to see what's really going to happen, how we got here. But it's a negative because of the fact that it's very hard to tell at points what is going on in this movie. What are we really getting towards? What is really happening here? Is this real? Is it not? I think the film could have done a better job of kind of filling in the gaps there, but I understand that this is a film that wants to treat the audience as smart as possible, wants to be a film that really leads you to, draw your own conclusions. And I respect films that do that, but I feel like this movie needed a little bit more going on to like really make that impact, especially the way the movie wraps up. I think they could have done a better job with that overall. But again, just style-wise and things like that, I can't help but really just admire a lot of what this film is really going for. I dare you to find a film that is anything like this, because it really is very much its own thing, and I very much do respect it. I just wish it was a little bit more clear what was going on, and I felt a little bit more satisfied by the way this film ended up wrapping up. But other than that, I think this is definitely a film I recommend for sure. It was at Sundance. I wanted to catch it there, didn't get to watch it until way later down the line, but I'm glad that I was able to see it, because I do think it is very much worth watching. Just don't expect like a wholly satisfying experience, because that's not really what this is. Definitely a B- for Censor. I think it has some really strong ideas. It's very ambitious, and for that I definitely recommend it. Another movie that's very different from what I was expecting, in Cop Shop. I went into this film kind of expecting just sort of like derivative action movie that we've seen 1,000 times before, but this movie is way more contained than that. The entire movie takes place in a jail cell. You have this whole sort of feud going on between two gangsters, and you have this cop that's kind of pulled in the middle of it, and it's really interesting to watch because you generally don't know what side she is going to fall on. Where is she really going to go as a character? And Alexis Louder is so good in this role. What the movie doesn't tell you, the trailer at least, is that she is the main character of this movie, and I think her entire story is so interesting, how she really ended up in this role. There's a lot of stuff that she's been through in her life that we dive into deeper as the movie goes on, and I thought they do a really good job with that. And every single actor is just really killing it here. Gerard Butler, this is way way more like what I want to see from him. He chews up all of the scenery in this movie whenever he's on screen. Bob Vidic is someone that you really do feel yourself attached to, but you also feel just as attached to Frank Grillo, and their whole feud that's going on is so funny to watch. There's a lot of great dark comedy in this movie, and I think it honestly does work very well. Toby Huss is also great here. He's really hamming it up as Anthony Lamb, and he's so good as that character. All of the acting here is fantastic in this movie, and Joe Carnahan really just continues to establish himself, I think, as one of the best directors of action working today. He does such a good job when it comes to knowing when to pull back on it, but also knowing when to fully go for the action here. I think he knows exactly what kind of movie he's making, and I really do applaud him for doing that, because this just feels like a movie we just don't see very much anymore. You know, we're so used to like these like big budget action films. This one's a lot more like self-contained, and I think it's more impressive because of that. The places that this movie's willing to go, a lot more character development than I was expecting. Overall, I was just a really big fan of this one, so definitely I would say a B+ for Cop Shop. I think there's some directions it takes that work really well, and it's another movie that really just kind of snuck up on me. I wish I saw this one in theaters and didn't wait till, you know, everyone had seen it, but definitely lived up to the hype for sure. This movie, literally nobody saw Queen Pins. I've heard absolutely nobody talk about this movie, and it's a little bit of a shame because I actually do think it works quite well for what it's going for. The premise itself is really kind of wacky, and you forget about the fact that this actually did happen, and I think that's something that was really great when it comes to this movie, is that it is just so out there that you kind of forget about that, but to my knowledge, this story did in fact happen, where we had this housewife who was kind of like dissatisfied, and she wanted to, you know, she teamed up with her best friend to go on this like illegal coupon scheme of sorts, and you know, they're scamming from all of these different corporations, and that's a really fun idea, and it also helps that Kristen Bell and especially Kirby Howell-Baptiste are so good in this role. They work so well together. They're characters that you do find yourself latching onto. I especially really like Baptiste's character. She's this like vlogger of sorts, and she's constantly, you know, she's someone that's very popular on like social media, and so, you know, the way she gets involved in this and things like that is just a lot of fun to watch, and I really did enjoy their overall dynamic in this movie. And there's a little bit more going on with Kristen Bell's character and why she really has chosen this particular lifestyle. There's something that's gone on recently in her life, and the movie actually does take a good amount of time to really like dive deep into it, and that's something that I really did appreciate. But also contrasting that with the dynamic between Paul Walter Hauser and Vince Vaughn might be the highlight of the entire movie, I gotta say. Paul Walter Hauser is someone that he is like so eager to get to the bottom of things, but he also has no experience whatsoever when it comes to being a cop. And when him and Vince Vaughn, who again is a lot more just kind of like no nonsense in that way, very by the book, when they start to interact, the movie I think especially is really at its best. I love the dynamic between these two, and I think those two dynamics are really enough to latch you onto this film. The thing that does bring it down is that I think the movie is way too long. There's especially the second act, there are points where it really did drag for me. The comedy also I found to be a little bit hit or miss at some points, and I think when it hits really well, and the movie really did have me laughing at quite a few points, but I won't lie in saying there were some points that didn't really work for me in the way that I think they wanted it to. Also, BB Rex's character, I needed a lot more from in this movie. Every single scene with her is pretty much the same, where you have Kristen Bell and Kirby Howell-Baptiste, and they're trying to like acquire money from her and things like that, and they don't really do all that much with her at the end. But by the time this movie wrapped up and we eventually get to, you know, what ends up happening with these characters, I really just found myself enjoying this overall. I wish that this film got a much better release in terms of marketing, because I do think this could have been like a really good like sleeper hit, but nobody really went to see this at all. This was such a big commercial failure. They kind of just like dumped it onto Paramount Plus, and I think it's a much better movie than that, honestly. I think I can understand why some people didn't really enjoy this one, but I thought that it was a lot of fun, especially for those four performances that I mentioned, Paul Walter Hauser especially is probably the standout of this entire movie. He continues to show why he's just one of the best character actors working today. Anything that he gets his hands on, he's a huge standout for me. Just really enjoyed this one quite a bit. I think that it honestly is a lot of fun. So B- for Queen Pins. It's not a perfect movie or anything like that, but I think for what it is, it honestly was a lot of fun, and I wish it had a little bit more of a fan base. Bergman Island is the kind of film that really just kind of sneaks up on you. You're not really expecting much from it, and by the time it ends, you're really just kind of won over by what it's going for, and that was exactly how I felt about this movie overall. What I really love right off the bat is the romance that we're centering on in this movie and the different perspectives where, you have Tim Roth, who is so deeply in love with Ingmar Bergman, loves him as a filmmaker, loves to go on and on about certain techniques he employed as like a director. And then you have Vicky Krieps, who is actually the main character of this movie, who, may I just say, it's so great to see her in a film that actually utilizes her well as an actress. She is amazing in this movie, and I absolutely loved her character here. She's a lot more skeptical. She, doesn't like a lot of the things that went down in Bergman's personal life, and she isn't really as big of a fan of him, but yet she loves him as a filmmaker. She really admires a lot of the things that he's done, and she isn't really sure how to feel about a lot of this, and I really like that sort of dynamic and how this really kind of gets them to explore certain difficulties within their relationship and certain issues that they're having. I think both of them work very well here together, and I found both of them to give really strong performances. Like I said, Vicky Krieps really I found to be the big standout of this entire movie. She's the character you find yourself the most attached to, especially when we start to dive deeper into the screenplay that she's writing. I think the movie does do a really good job with that. And then contrasting that eventually with this story she's telling about Mia Wasikowska and Anders Danielsen Lai's characters, I think the film did a pretty good job with that too, because I found myself just as attached to what was really going on there. Although I will say my only issue with the movie is that I think the structure, it wasn't the best. I think the movie honestly would have benefited more if it was more of like a back and forth, because there is a significant gap of this film that is devoted solely to just that story. And I found that story interesting, but at that point in the movie, I was so drawn to what was going on with the main storyline that veering away from it, I did find myself just a little antsy. I was hoping to get back into it, but I still liked what they ended up doing. I like the parallels that this movie went on. The cinematography is just absolutely gorgeous. Some of the best locations I think you'll see in any film last year. Just absolutely beautiful to look at. Mia Hansen-Levy has so much to say here about art and how that really does, affect our day-to-day lives and things like that. Overall, I just really enjoyed this one quite a bit. I think it's a movie not enough people have really seen, but I really do recommend this one. If you're a film lover, especially if you like Ingmar Bergman or any kind of like films like that, I think this film is really going to impress you with what it ends up doing. Overall, definitely a film that I enjoyed quite a bit. So A- for Bergman Island. I really wish more people were talking about this one. Oh, look, it's the other movie that I forgot to talk about. And to be honest, this one, I have literally no idea how I forgot to talk about it, because it's one that I actually really did like quite a bit. That's The Souvenir Part 2. You guys know, the first movie, I really wasn't a big fan of. I think that there were some interesting ideas behind it. Honor Swinton Byrne gave a really good performance. But like beyond that, I just found it to be very slow, kind of dull, and honestly just kind of languid in terms of its pacing, and it just didn't really do much for me at all. The sequel, on the other hand, I like considerably more. Right off the bat, I think what this movie does a really good job with is it feels like Joanna Hogg has listened to a lot of criticisms from the first movie, because the first movie does have a fan base, but I feel like over the years especially, people just have not really become that fond of that film, and I think it's because like it just doesn't really have a lot of rewatchability to it. It's very slow to watch. Like, yeah, you feel bad for her character and things like that, but like beyond that, there just really isn't a lot that I latched onto in that film. And what Hogg does instead is she takes that movie and basically does something completely different here. I think this sequel, one, tonally, it's very different. Yes, there are some very somber moments, obviously, when it focuses on Julie reflecting on her life, but Julie this time is a much more compelling character because we focus a lot more on how she's going to try to move on from this, and her becoming this filmmaker and how much she wants to, devote time to this student film that she's making and how seriously she really does take it. And that character I found to be a lot more interesting than just kind of like a hapless victim that we really don't know all that much about in the first film. And that's not to say she didn't have agency in the first movie, it's just we didn't really get to see a lot of her on her own. Here, this time around, we get to see a lot more of her being independent, and it just makes for a much more interesting character. It also helps that there are points here that the movie doesn't always take itself so seriously. The movie is quite lighthearted at points, especially whenever Richard Ayoade pops up on the screen. He is a huge scene stealer throughout this entire movie. He is this movie star of sorts that is giving Julie a lot of advice about her film, and I thought that he was definitely one of the big standouts of this entire movie. Every scene he pops up, he's not in the movie a ton, but whenever he pops up, he really just kind of steals the spotlight from everyone, and I loved what he ended up doing here. And again, I think Honor Swinton Byrne just has a lot more to work with this time around, because not only is she reflecting on the events of the first movie, but you also get to see a more independent and a more calmer side of her that we didn't get to see in that first film. It just feels like she's a little bit more at ease in this film, but she's also trying to get over everything that ended up happening. And I think those conversations actually do make the relationship a lot more interesting to me. Especially when it comes to her mother. Tilda Swinton, not in this movie nearly as much as the first one, but there's a really good scene with her where, she starts to talk about the guy that Julie was seeing and how she kind of felt about him, and it added a whole new layer to that movie, and I really liked what they ended up doing with that, so I thought that was very well done. I know that both of these films have been very personal for Joanna Hogg, but this one just felt a lot more personal to me. Like, it felt like this was kind of the destination all along. Like, the first movie was an idea of what she wanted to do, but this is like full-fledged, like this is exactly what she's been wanting to get out of these films, and I think she absolutely does here. She does a really good job when it comes to this film. It's also a lot better paced. This one is not over 2 hours long, and I just found it to be a lot easier to watch in that way. The cinematography is also really great here. The movie that Julie's making is very interesting to watch, and I liked what ended up becoming of that as well. So yeah, overall, I like this one a lot more. I think that there's a lot more that you can root for. There's a lot more to latch onto. It's not always this like self-serious film that just makes you kind of miserable throughout, and I'm fine with like movies that make me feel miserable. There just wasn't a lot to latch onto in that film, and here I felt like there was a lot more of a goal. There was a lot more development when it came to Julie, and I really did appreciate that. My only real issue with this movie is that I feel like there are some characters, particularly the men that she tends to, fraternize, particularly the men that she strikes up conversations with in this movie. They just don't do much for me at all. I didn't find any of their characters to be that interesting. Aside from, I will say, Joe Alwyn, I thought his character was pretty good. I liked what they ended up doing with him, but like beyond that, Harris Dickinson, Charlie Heaton just don't really make that much of an impression for me in this movie. I know that Robert Pattinson was originally supposed to be here, and I'm interested in seeing what that version of this movie would have been like, but beyond that, I mean, there really isn't too much that I disliked about this one at all. I think this is a significant improvement over the first movie. Definitely a B+ for The Souvenir Part 2. I was not really on board with the first movie at all, but after this one, I can say I'm a fan, and whatever Joanna Hogg has in store, I am very much down for, because I really do like what she's trying to get out of these movies. I like what this film has to say about art and how you deal with it personally, but also how you use art as like a coping mechanism to deal with, past trauma and things like that. I like all of that. Just a really good film that I wish a lot more people end up seeing. I can understand why people didn't watch this one, probably because they were just kind of turned off from the first movie, but I would definitely recommend giving this one a watch. It's a lot different tonally. It goes in some directions that I don't think you would have expected from the first one, and I think it is far superior than what we ended up getting. So I definitely recommend this one. And the last film we are going to be discussing here is one I actually was going to do an individual review for, and that is Cyrano, a movie that I was so incredibly hyped for, and for the most part, really did live up to the hype that I did have for it. What I really like about this movie right off the bat is that it doesn't really try to be anything more than what it is. It understands that it's so unafraid of being this just very sweet and tender love story. And I feel like there are a lot of movies these days that really tries to like apologize for that, and this movie is so unapologetic when it comes to that. It doesn't care that it's really sappy, because it is very sappy at points, and sometimes, I won't lie, it can get a little bit too much, but I appreciate the fact that it goes for it, and I think that's something that Joe Wright as a director really does a good job here. He takes this classic story and he puts his own little spin on it, whether it's the changes made to some of these characters, you know, Cyrano especially. Usually this character has a really big nose from what I understand, and that's sort of like his deformity, and that's why he sees himself as ugly. But putting someone like Peter Dinklage, who, you know, obviously he is, he's someone who is, smaller in that way, and I think having someone like him in this movie, it brings this sort of personal touch to the film. It's like Peter Dinklage gets to explore this side of him that he never really has been able to before. You know, I remember a couple months back, he talked about, you know, his distaste with Snow White, and that he didn't like the way the dwarves were portrayed in that movie. And it feels like this was kind of his chance to sort of like channel that and really dive into like why that affects him so much. And I think that he just gives such a strong performance in this film. It's really a shame that he was snubbed for this year's Oscars, because he just pours so much heart and soul into this role. You just want to like give Cyrano a big hug and like let him know everything's going to be okay. You know, he has this connection to Roxanne. He cares so much about everyone, but he has no idea how to really express it. And I think that's something that they just do such an incredible job with here. And Dinklage just really kills it in this movie. Maybe his best performance to date, to be honest with you. I loved what he ended up doing here. And Haley Bennett is also really good here. She brings a lot of heart to Roxanne and really just kind of shows how overlooked she's been as an actress. I've always said Bennett is an actress where when she has the right role, she really does show how great she can be, and they give a lot of layers to Roxanne. The way she looks at love I found to be very fascinating. The chemistry between these two is also so good. I think you can see how they really do kind of bring out the best in each other. Cyrano sees her as this girl that has such an interesting way of looking at love. You know, she wants to focus more on the language and the way that people say things to her, and say these these affirmations. That's what really matters the most to her, and you can see that he really does want to give her that, and that's something that you really do just latch onto in this movie. Some of the scenes between them are really when this film is at its best, and I think they do a really good job with that here. Kelvin Harrison Jr. and Ben Mendelsohn are also really great here for what they do have, and the idea to make this movie a musical, I won't lie, I was kind of unsure about it. I didn't really know if this particular story, especially since it's, such a classic story, it's not known for being a musical, I didn't know if that was really going to work. But for the most part, it really does, and it added a lot to the emotional heft of the story very well. I won't lie, some of the songs are a bit hit or miss for me, but when they hit, they definitely did hit, and I thought it worked very well with what this movie was trying to go for, especially the song Wherever I Fall. It was a song that I really wasn't expecting, but it comes at the perfect time in the movie, and it's definitely the song I've listened to the most. That was easily the standout of this film for me, and I think that song alone is worth the price of admission. I know Every Letter has been getting a lot of momentum as well. The National did a lot of the songs for this movie, and that's a really good one. I will say the one thing to know going into this, that the film overall is rather simplistic. It doesn't really get much deeper than just Cyrano loves Roxanne, but he's too ashamed and he wants to do anything to help her, and he kind of uses, he helps Christian write letters to her as a way to like really express his love, but also, cares about Christian and things like that. It doesn't really become much more than that, but I didn't really get too bothered by any of that because I found these characters interesting enough. But there are some elements that I think need to be dived into a bit more, particularly the character of Christian. I just think needed a little bit more to him. He really is just kind of like the dim-witted type character who he doesn't really speak that well. He has a very hard time like expressing himself, but you can see that he has this love for Roxanne. He wants to try to express it as much as he can, and you do find yourself really drawn to him because of that, but also because of Calvin Harrison Jr.'s performance. But I just wish there were a little bit more layers to him as a character, because there's something missing. Ben Mendelsohn's character, though, really did not work that well here for me. He really is just kind of like the one note, like power hungry type villain. He wants Roxanne all to himself. The song that he has in the film is easily the film's worst. It's literally him just being like, I deserve this, I deserve that, and it does not work very well at all here. I didn't find his character particularly compelling, and again, Mendelsohn's really good in the role, but they just didn't really do all that much with him here. And I just think there were some elements that could have been dived into a bit. But I will say, in terms of set design especially, holy shit, I mean, this film is just absolutely immaculate in terms of that. It really can't take your eyes off of any of the costume design that's going on in this movie. And the love story itself is very powerful on its own, that you do find yourself latched onto what's going on. It's not as strong as like some other musicals to come out last year, but it has such a genuine heart and powerful type, vibe to it that it's just very hard to resist any of what this movie's going for. It's very passionate in that way, and I think it's gonna win the hearts of a lot of people. It has won the hearts of a lot of people, and while I said it's not consistent in all aspects, there's one song especially, though, Whenever I Fell, that alone is worth the price of admission. That song is absolutely incredible, and I highly recommend, that part of the movie. There's some directions it took that I honestly was pretty surprised by, and by the time it wrapped up, I really just found myself fully bought into the heart and soul of this movie. So overall, I can recommend this one. Like I said, it's not anything amazing, but I think for what it is, it does a really damn good job of really selling you on it. So yeah, I would give this one a B overall. I think that it's a really charming movie. It's a very interesting direction to make this a musical, but again, it has such a genuine sort of soul that I really just found myself won over by the time it ended. Oh my god, we've made it to the end, guys. That was a lot of movies to talk about, some of which, like I said, I didn't really remember all that much, but I tried to talk about them to the best of my recollection. But other than that, we have made it through the catch-up reviews. I appreciate you guys sticking with me throughout all of this, and the best list will be coming very soon now. I know I've been saying that, but it will be coming very soon. I'm going to try to get that out as soon as I possibly can. In terms of catch-up reviews itself, don't expect to get these very often. This is really just something that I will go to if, there's just a bunch of movies that I didn't get to talk about in the What I Watched video that I really wanted to. This will probably be one of the last ones for a little bit. I'll still do, the Christmas one and things like that, but aside from that, you're not going to see a lot of catch-up reviews on this channel. We're going to default more to the What I Watched videos because it's just a lot more consistent and it's easier for me to do that. So yeah, other than that though, guys, that's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll see you guys in my next video, and I will see you guys for that. Okay, bye.